The silence that descended upon the imperial palace in the wake of the siege of Terra was not the peace of victory, but the hollow quiet of a Pyrrhic triumph that had cost the Imperium its very soul. Within the deepest vaults of the palace, the Emperor of Mankind lay broken and dying upon the golden throne, his physical form shattered by the final confrontation with Horus aboard the vengeful spirit. The arcane mechanisms of the ancient device, originally designed as a psychic amplifier for the Imperial Webway project, now served as a life support system for the Master of Mankind, binding his essence to the material realm through constant agony. The immediate aftermath of the Emperor's interment created a crisis of governance that threatened to tear apart what remained of the Imperium. For over 2 centuries, the Emperor had been the absolute authority, the final arbiter of all decisions both great and small. His word had been law, his will the driving force behind the Great Crusade's expansion across the galaxy. Now, with his physical form confined to the Golden Throne, and his consciousness locked in an eternal battle against the forces of chaos within the warp, the vast machinery of imperial administration found itself rudderless. The High Lords of Terra, a collection of the most senior imperial officials, scrambled to fill the void left by the Emperor's absence. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor and the First Lord Commander of the Imperium, had sacrificed himself to maintain the Golden Throne during the Emperor's final battle with Horus. His death removed the one individual who might have provided continuity and stability during this crucial transition period. The remaining High Lords, including representatives from the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Army, and various administrative bodies, found themselves thrust into roles they had never been intended to fulfill. The power vacuum extended far beyond Terra's administrative chambers. Throughout the Imperium, planetary governors, sector commanders, and other imperial officials struggled to maintain order without clear directives from the throne. Communication networks, already strained by years of civil war, became unreliable as astropathic choirs across the galaxy reported increasing difficulty in maintaining psychic contact. The Emperor's weakened state had a direct impact on the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that enabled faster-than-light travel throughout the Imperium. Navigation through the warp became increasingly treacherous, further hampering efforts to coordinate the Imperial response to the crisis. The death of Horus Lupercal aboard his flagship had created its own set of complications for both loyalist and traitor forces. The Warmaster's authority structure, built around his personal charisma and the bonds of brotherhood between the Primarchs, collapsed instantly with his demise. The Traitor Legions, already showing signs of internal discord and mutation, found themselves without unified leadership. However, rather than providing immediate relief to the loyalist cause, this development introduced new uncertainties about how the remaining traitor forces would respond to their newfound independence. The Sons of Horus, leaderless and demoralized by their Gene Father's death, began a chaotic retreat from the Sol system. Their withdrawal was neither orderly nor coordinated, with different companies and battalions making their own decisions about where to flee. Some elements of the Legion attempted to rally around surviving captains, while others descended into internecine warfare as they fought over the Legion's remaining resources and the right to claim Horus's legacy. The other traitor legions faced similar challenges. The World Eaters, already consumed by the Butcher's nails and their bloodthirsty nature, fragmented into smaller warbands that began attacking anything in their path, including other traitor forces. The Emperor's children, corrupted by their pursuit of perfection and excess, retreated into the depths of their ships to indulge in increasingly depraved rituals. The Death Guard, their ranks already beginning to show signs of the plagues that would later define them, withdrew in sullen silence, their loyalty to Mortarion superseding any allegiance they might have felt to the Warmaster's cause. For the Loyalist legions, the immediate aftermath of the siege brought its own devastating revelations. The casualty reports that filtered in from across the Sol system painted a picture of losses so catastrophic that they threatened the very existence of several legions. The Imperial Fists, who had borne the brunt of the siege's defensive operations, reported losses exceeding 60% of their pre-war strength. Entire companies had been wiped out during the fighting in the palace's outer defenses, and many of the survivors bore wounds that would never fully heal. The Blood Angels had suffered perhaps the most psychologically damaging losses. The death of their Primarch Sanguinius at the hands of Horus had triggered a phenomenon that would later be known as the Black Rage, a berserker fury that consumed many of the Legion's warriors. Those battle brothers who had been present during Sanguinius's final moments reported shared visions of their Primarch's death, experiencing his agony and rage as if it were their own. The Legion's librarians worked desperately to understand and contain this new affliction, but their efforts met with limited success. The White Scars, who had arrived late to the siege after their harrowing journey through the warp, found their numbers severely depleted by the fighting in the palace's outer reaches. The Khan's warriors had fought with their characteristic speed and ferocity, but the grinding nature of siege warfare had taken a heavy toll on a legion accustomed to mobile warfare. Many of their jet bikes and land speeders lay destroyed in the rubble of the palace's defensive positions, and the survivors faced the grim prospect of rebuilding their entire tactical doctrine. The Ultramarines, despite their reputation for organization and efficiency, faced their own challenges in the aftermath of the siege. Robute Guilliman had arrived at Terra with a substantial force, but the fighting had cost them dearly. More significantly, the Ultramarines found themselves grappling with the realization that their absence from the early stages of the Horus Heresy had allowed the traitor forces to gain crucial advantages. The guilt and frustration felt by many Ultramarines would drive their subsequent actions during the Great Scouring. The Iron Hands, already decimated by the events at Istvan V, had contributed what forces they could to the defense of Terra, but their numbers remained perilously low. The clan companies that had survived the drop site massacre had fought with cold determination, but the Legion's leadership structure remained fractured. Without Ferrus Manus to guide them, the Iron Hands struggled to maintain cohesion and purpose. The Salamanders and Raven Guard, fellow survivors of the Istvan V massacre, faced similar challenges. Both legions had spent years rebuilding their strength after the traitor ambush, but their numbers remained far below their pre-war levels. The psychological scars of betrayal ran deep among their ranks, and many battle brothers struggled with feelings of survivor's guilt and a burning desire for vengeance against the traitor legions. The Space Wolves, who had been savage during their assault on Prospero and subsequent battles, found themselves in a unique position. Their feral nature and pack mentality had served them well during the siege, but the losses they had sustained threatened to undermine their traditional tribal structure. The great companies that had fought on Terra bore little resemblance to their pre-war organization, with many pack leaders dead and their warriors scattered among surviving units. The Dark Angels presented perhaps the most complex situation among the loyalist legions. Lionel Johnson had arrived at Terra with a substantial force, but the Legion's internal divisions had become increasingly apparent during the fighting. The presence of fallen angels among the traitor forces had created a crisis of faith within the Legion's ranks, and many battle brothers struggled to understand how their former brothers could have turned against the Emperor. The secretive nature of the Dark Angels' command structure made it difficult for other legions to assess their true condition, but it was clear that they faced challenges that went beyond simple casualty figures. The logistical challenges facing the loyalist forces were immense. The Sol system's infrastructure had been severely damaged during the siege, with orbital facilities, supply depots, and manufacturing centers either destroyed or operating at reduced capacity. The Mechanicum's forges on Mars had been compromised by the conflict between loyalist and traitor tech priests, limiting the Imperium's ability to produce new equipment and ammunition. The Imperial army units that had survived the siege were scattered and demoralized, their command structure disrupted by the loss of countless officers and the breakdown of communication networks. Medical facilities across the Sol system overflowed with wounded warriors, both Astartes and mortal soldiers. The apothecaries of the various legions worked tirelessly to treat the injured, but many wounds defied conventional treatment. Chaos corruption had introduced new forms of injury and disease that required entirely new approaches to healing. The psychological trauma suffered by many survivors proved even more challenging to address, as the horrors witnessed during the siege had left deep scars on the minds of those who had endured them. The strategic implications of the Loyalist Legion's losses became increasingly apparent as the initial shock of victory began to wear off. The Imperium had emerged victorious from the siege of Terra, but at a cost that threatened its ability to maintain control over its vast territories. With the Emperor incapacitated and the loyalist legions severely weakened, the remaining traitor forces retained the potential to cause significant damage if they chose to continue their rebellion rather than flee into the Eye of Terror. Intelligence reports from across the galaxy painted a troubling picture of the Imperium's strategic position. Traitor forces remained active in numerous sectors, and their withdrawal from Terra did not necessarily indicate a complete defeat. The word-bearers, who had been instrumental in corrupting other legions, remained largely intact and continued their efforts to spread chaos worship throughout the Imperium. The Iron Warriors, master siege specialists, had suffered losses during the assault on Terra, but retained significant combat capability and a burning desire for revenge against the Imperial fists. The Alpha Legion's activities remained largely mysterious, as was typical for the secretive 20th Legion. Their involvement in the Horus Heresy had been characterized by infiltration and misdirection rather than direct confrontation, and their true losses during the siege were difficult to assess. This uncertainty added another layer of complexity to the Loyalist forces' strategic planning, as they could not be certain whether the Alpha Legion posed a continued threat or had been effectively neutralized. The Thousand Sons, despite their devastating losses at Prospero, had played a role in the siege through their mastery of psychic warfare. Their fate remained uncertain, with some reports suggesting that they had been utterly destroyed, while others hinted at their survival in some transformed state. The implications of their continued existence, particularly given their association with the chaos god Tzeentch, weighed heavily on the minds of loyalist commanders. As the immediate crisis on Terra began to stabilize, the loyalist legions faced the daunting task of reorganizing their forces for the campaigns that lay ahead. The traditional command structures that had served them during the Great Crusade were no longer adequate for the challenges they now faced. The loss of so many experienced officers and the integration of survivors from decimated units required new approaches to leadership and organization. The question of how to pursue the fleeing traitor forces became a source of heated debate among the surviving Primarchs and senior commanders. Some argued for immediate pursuit, seeking to capitalize on the traitors' disarray and prevent them from regrouping in the Eye of Terror. Others advocated for a more cautious approach, emphasizing the need to rebuild the loyalist forces and secure the Imperium's core territories before embarking on offensive operations. The political ramifications of the siege's conclusion extended far beyond military considerations. The Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne had fundamentally altered the nature of imperial governance, creating a power structure that would define the Imperium for millennia to come. The High Lords of Terra found themselves wielding authority that had previously been reserved for the Emperor alone, but they lacked the divine mandate and absolute power that had made his rule unquestionable. The transformation of Roboute Guilliman from Legion Commander to de facto leader of the Great Scouring emerged not through formal appointment, but through practical necessity and his unparalleled organizational capabilities. In the chaotic weeks following the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne, the surviving Primarchs and senior commanders found themselves grappling with the monumental task of coordinating a galaxy-wide response to the fleeing traitor forces. While the High Lords of Terra struggled to establish their authority over civilian governance, the military aspects of the crisis required immediate attention from those who understood the complexities of trans-galactic warfare. Guilliman's emergence as the coordinating authority stemmed from several factors that distinguished him from his surviving brothers. The Ultramarines Primarch had arrived at Terra with not only substantial military forces, but also an intact command structure that had proven its effectiveness during the Shadow Crusade and subsequent campaigns. His theoretical and practical knowledge of logistics, combined with his experience in governing the 500 worlds of Ultramar, provided him with a unique understanding of the challenges involved in coordinating multiple Legion forces across vast distances. Unlike some of his brothers who excelled in specific aspects of warfare, Guilliman possessed the comprehensive skill set necessary to orchestrate the complex military operations that lay ahead. The establishment of Guilliman's coordinating role began with informal consultations among the surviving Primarchs and senior commanders present on Terra. The Lion, despite his tactical brilliance and the Dark Angel's substantial remaining strength, had demonstrated a tendency towards secretive operations that made him less suitable for the transparent coordination required. Rogel Dorn, though respected for his defensive expertise and the Imperial Fist's heroic stand during the siege, was deeply affected by the losses his legion had sustained and the psychological burden of having failed to prevent the Emperor's near death. The Khan, ever the free spirit, showed little interest in the administrative aspects of large-scale coordination, preferring to focus on the immediate tactical challenges facing his depleted White Scars. Guilliman's approach to establishing his authority was characteristically methodical and diplomatic. Rather than asserting dominance through force or political maneuvering, he began by offering practical solutions to the immediate problems facing the loyalist forces. His first major initiative involved the creation of a comprehensive assessment of loyalist strength across all theaters of operation. This undertaking required the establishment of secure communication networks, the standardization of reporting procedures, and the development of new protocols for inter-legion cooperation. The muster of surviving loyalist forces revealed the true extent of the devastation wrought by the Horus Heresy. The Imperial Fists, despite their reputation for stoic endurance, had been reduced to approximately 38% of their pre-war strength. The survivors bore the physical and psychological scars of the siege, with many battle brothers requiring extensive medical treatment and psychological counseling. The Legion's command structure had been severely disrupted, with numerous captains and senior officers among the casualties. The loss of experienced leadership created gaps that would take decades to fill, forcing the promotion of younger warriors who lacked the seasoned judgment of their predecessors. The Ultramarines, despite their substantial numbers, had suffered significant losses during their journey to Terra and the subsequent fighting. Their casualties were particularly concentrated among the veteran companies that had borne the brunt of the combat operations. The Legion's strength stood at approximately 62% of pre-war levels, but this figure masked the disproportionate losses among experienced sergeants and officers. The surviving Ultramarines faced the challenge of integrating new recruits while maintaining their traditional standards of discipline and tactical excellence. The Dark Angels presented a complex picture that defied simple numerical assessment. While their overall casualties were moderate compared to some other legions, the psychological impact of discovering fallen angels among the traitor forces had created deep divisions within their ranks. The Legion's strength was estimated at 55% of pre-war levels, but significant numbers of battle brothers had been reassigned to specialized units tasked with hunting down the fallen. This internal mission would consume increasing amounts of the Legion's resources and attention, limiting their availability for broader Imperial operations. The Blood Angels faced perhaps the most challenging situation among the surviving legions. Their numerical strength had been reduced to approximately 41% of pre-war levels, but the emergence of the Black Rage among their ranks created additional complications. The afflicted battle brothers, consumed by visions of Sanguinius's death and an uncontrollable berserker fury, required constant supervision and specialized handling. The Legion's sanguinary priests worked tirelessly to understand and treat the condition, but their efforts met with limited success. The psychological trauma extended beyond those directly affected, as the entire Legion struggled to cope with the loss of their beloved Primarch and the implications of their genetic curse. The Iron Hands, already devastated by the events at Istvan V, had contributed what forces they could to the defense of Terra, but their numbers remained critically low. The clan companies that had survived the drop site massacre represented only 28% of the Legion's original strength. The absence of Ferrus Manus continued to create leadership challenges, as the Iron Hands' traditional clan structure struggled to adapt to their reduced circumstances. The surviving Iron Fathers attempted to maintain discipline and purpose, but the Legion's effectiveness was severely compromised by their limited numbers and fractured command structure. The Salamanders faced similar challenges, with their strength reduced to approximately 31% of pre-war levels. The Legion's emphasis on craftsmanship and their close ties to the civilian population of Nocturne had created additional complications, as many battle brothers struggled with the desire to return home and protect their families. The Salamander's traditional role as protectors of humanity had been complicated by the revelation that other humans could fall to chaos corruption, creating philosophical challenges that extended beyond simple military considerations. The Raven Guard, despite their expertise in stealth and infiltration, had suffered disproportionate losses during the siege due to the nature of the fighting. Their strength stood at approximately 29% of pre-war levels, with many of their specialized units decimated during reconnaissance and sabotage operations. The Legion's reliance on stealth tactics had proven less effective in the grinding urban warfare that characterized the siege, forcing them to adapt their traditional methods to new circumstances. The Space Wolves presented unique challenges in terms of assessment and integration. Their tribal structure and fierce independence made them difficult to coordinate with other legions, despite their proven effectiveness in combat. The great companies that had fought on Terra bore little resemblance to their pre-war organization, with traditional pack structures disrupted by casualties and the integration of survivors from decimated units. The Legion's strength was estimated at approximately 43% of pre-war levels, but their effectiveness remained high due to their adaptability and fierce loyalty to the Emperor. The White Scars, despite their late arrival at Terra, had suffered significant losses during the siege. Their strength stood at approximately 37% of pre-war levels, with many of their specialized vehicles and equipment destroyed during the fighting. The Legion's emphasis on mobility and speed had been compromised by the static nature of siege warfare, forcing them to develop new tactical approaches that differed significantly from their traditional methods. Guilliman's assessment of Legion capabilities extended beyond simple numerical strength to encompass factors such as morale, equipment status, and specialized skills. The Ultramarines Primarch recognized that the traditional approach to Legion organization, based on the assumption of near-infinite resources and recruits, was no longer viable in the post-Heresy environment. The development of new organizational structures required careful consideration of each Legion's unique characteristics and capabilities. The establishment of new command structures began with the creation of theater commands that would coordinate operations across different sectors of the galaxy. Guilliman's approach emphasized flexibility and adaptation, recognizing that the diverse challenges facing the Imperium required different tactical approaches in different regions. The theater commands were designed to provide strategic direction while allowing individual legions to maintain their unique characteristics and methods. The Segmentum Solar Command, encompassing the core systems of the Imperium, was assigned to Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists. Despite their losses, the 7th Legion's expertise in defensive operations and their intimate knowledge of the Sol system's defenses made them the logical choice for protecting the Imperium's heartland. The command structure was designed to integrate surviving Imperial Army units and newly recruited forces, while maintaining the high standards of discipline and organization that characterized the Imperial Fists. The Segmentum Obscurus Command was assigned to the Lion and the Dark Angels, taking advantage of their expertise in combined arms operations and their substantial remaining strength. The First Legion's secretive nature was seen as an asset in dealing with the uncertain loyalties and hidden threats that characterized the Galactic North. The command structure was designed to provide the Lion with maximum operational flexibility while maintaining coordination with other theater commands. The Segmentum Tempestus Command was assigned to the Khan and the White Scars, despite their reduced numbers. The 5th Legion's expertise in rapid deployment and mobile warfare made them ideal for dealing with the scattered traitor forces and emerging threats throughout the galactic south. The command structure emphasized speed and flexibility, allowing the White Scars to respond quickly to emerging threats while coordinating with other legions as needed. The Segmentum Pacificus Command was assigned to a joint force comprising elements from multiple legions, reflecting the diverse challenges and opportunities present in the Galactic West. The command structure was designed to test new approaches to inter-legion cooperation while providing a training ground for the integration of different tactical doctrines and organizational methods. The delegation of specialized roles within each theater command reflected Guilliman's understanding of the unique capabilities and limitations of each legion. The Blood Angels, despite their numerical losses and the challenges posed by the Black Rage, were assigned specialized assault roles that took advantage of their natural aggression and combat prowess. The Salamanders were tasked with equipment maintenance and logistics support, utilizing their expertise in craftsmanship and their methodical approach to problem solving. The Iron Hands, despite their reduced numbers, were assigned specialized roles in armored warfare and siege operations, taking advantage of their expertise with technology and their methodical approach to combat. The Raven Guard were tasked with reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, utilizing their expertise in stealth and infiltration to provide crucial information about traitor movements and intentions. The integration of surviving Imperial Army units into the new command structures presented additional challenges that required careful consideration. The mortal soldiers who had survived the siege were traumatized and demoralized, requiring extensive retraining and psychological support. The traditional relationship between Astartes and mortal forces had been complicated by the revelation that humans could fall to chaos corruption, creating trust issues that would take time to resolve. The establishment of new supply lines and logistics networks required the reconstruction of much of the Imperium's infrastructure. The Forges of Mars, damaged during the conflict between loyalist and traitor tech priests, operated at reduced capacity and required extensive repairs. The development of new manufacturing centers and supply depots became a priority as the loyalist forces prepared for the long campaigns that lay ahead. The coordination of intelligence gathering and analysis became another crucial aspect of the new command structures. The Alpha Legion's infiltration tactics and the Word-Bearer's corruption efforts had demonstrated the importance of understanding enemy capabilities and intentions. The establishment of new intelligence networks required the integration of different Legion approaches to reconnaissance and surveillance, creating standardized procedures while maintaining the flexibility needed to adapt to changing circumstances. The psychological aspects of command integration proved as challenging as the logistical considerations. The surviving Primarchs and senior commanders carried the weight of their losses and the knowledge that their former brothers had turned against the Emperor. The development of new command relationships required careful attention to personality conflicts and philosophical differences that had been suppressed during the unity of the Great Crusade. The death of Horus Lupercal aboard the Vengeful Spirit had severed the single thread that held the traitor alliance together, transforming what had been a coordinated rebellion into a chaotic exodus of competing factions. The War Master's corpse had barely cooled before the first signs of discord emerged among his former allies, as Legion commanders who had subordinated their ambitions to his vision suddenly found themselves free to pursue their own agendas. The carefully constructed hierarchy that had enabled the Siege of Terra began to collapse within hours of Horus's demise, replaced by a power vacuum that would reshape the traitor forces fundamentally. The Sons of Horus faced the most immediate crisis of leadership, as their entire identity had been built around their Primarch's role as War Master. First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, who had served as Horus's primary lieutenant throughout the heresy, found himself thrust into a position he had never sought. The Legion's command structure, which had been streamlined to serve Horus's strategic vision, proved inadequate for the challenges of independent operation. Companies that had operated as extensions of the War Masters will suddenly lacked clear direction, with captains making contradictory decisions about retreat routes and objectives. The 16th Legion's withdrawal from the Sol system became a series of running battles between different factions within their own ranks. The Justaran Terminators, elite warriors who had served as Horus's personal guard, claimed authority over the Legion's remaining assets based on their proximity to the fallen Primarch. However, their claims were disputed by company commanders who had led successful operations during the siege and believed their battlefield achievements granted them equal legitimacy. The Sons of Horus fleet, which had been the backbone of the traitor naval forces, fragmented as different ship captains chose to follow different claimants to leadership. The breakdown of communication between Sons of Horus vessels created cascading failures throughout the traitor withdrawal. Ships that had relied on coordinated fleet movements found themselves isolated and vulnerable to loyalist pursuit. The vengeful spirit itself, massive and heavily damaged from the final battle, became a focal point of conflict as different factions attempted to claim control of the vessel. The ship's corridors echoed with the sounds of internecine warfare as former brothers turned their weapons on each other in desperate struggles for dominance. The World Eater's response to Horus's death was characteristically violent and immediate. The 12th Legion had already been fragmenting into smaller warbands throughout the latter stages of the heresy, as the Butcher's nails drove their warriors into increasingly uncontrollable frenzies. The removal of Horus's restraining influence eliminated the last vestiges of Legion cohesion, transforming the World Eaters into a collection of bloodthirsty raiders who attacked anything within reach. Their retreat from Terra became a rampage that claimed loyalist and traitor victims alike, as berserker squads turned on their former allies with the same fury they had displayed against Imperial defenders. Captain Karn, one of the few World Eaters officers who retained some measure of tactical awareness, attempted to rally scattered elements of the Legion around the principle of following Angron's example. However, the Red Angel's own degradation had accelerated throughout the siege, leaving him increasingly consumed by the influence of Khorne. The Primarch's sporadic appearances among his sons served more to inflame their bloodlust than to provide coherent leadership, creating a feedback loop of violence that made organized withdrawal impossible. The World Eater's ships became floating charnel houses as their crews succumbed to the same berserker rage that had consumed the Legion's ground forces. Naval battles between World Eaters vessels and other traitor ships erupted throughout the withdrawal, with boarding actions that left entire decks littered with corpses. The 12th Legion's fleet discipline, never particularly strong, collapsed entirely as ship captains followed their own violent impulses rather than any coherent strategic plan. The Emperor's children faced a different but equally destructive form of dissolution. The Third Legion's pursuit of perfection had been corrupted into an obsession with sensation and excess that made coherent military action increasingly difficult. Their withdrawal from Terra became an extended orgy of indulgence, as squads abandoned their posts to pursue increasingly depraved pleasures. The Legion's ships were transformed into floating palaces of excess, where former space marines engaged in rituals that would have been unthinkable during the Great Crusade. Fulgrim's influence over his legion had become increasingly erratic as his transformation into a demon prince progressed. The Primarch's appearances among his sons were sporadic and often counterproductive, as his changed nature inspired more fear than loyalty. The Emperor's children command structure, which had been based on the pursuit of tactical and strategic perfection, proved unable to adapt to their new reality. Officers who had once coordinated complex operations with mathematical precision found themselves unable to maintain focus on military objectives. The Third Legion's retreat became a series of increasingly bizarre episodes as different companies pursued their own interpretations of perfection. Some elements became obsessed with the artistic arrangement of corpses, spending precious time and resources on elaborate displays rather than military objectives. Others focused on the collection of exotic weapons and artifacts, launching raids against both loyalist and traitor forces to acquire items that caught their fancy. The Legion's once proud martial traditions were subsumed beneath layers of corruption that made them increasingly unreliable as military assets. The Death Guard's withdrawal was characterized by sullen determination rather than chaos, but their transformation had already begun to manifest in disturbing ways. The 14th Legion's ranks showed increasing signs of disease and decay, with many warriors developing suppurating wounds that refused to heal. Mortarian's influence over his sons remained strong, but the Primarch himself was undergoing changes that would eventually transform him into a servant of Nurgle. The Legion's traditional stoicism served them well during the retreat, but their growing corruption created new challenges for maintaining unit cohesion. The Death Guard fleet maintained better discipline than many other traitor forces, but their ships were becoming increasingly unsanitary as disease spread through the crews. The Legion's apothecaries, who had once been skilled healers, found themselves unable to treat the new ailments that plagued their brothers. The diseases that affected the Death Guard were not natural infections, but manifestations of chaos corruption that defied conventional medical treatment. The Legion's withdrawal became a race against time as their condition continued to deteriorate. The Iron Warriors' retreat was the most organized among the Traitor Legions, reflecting Perdurabo's emphasis on discipline and systematic planning. The 4th Legion had suffered significant losses during the siege, but their command structure remained intact and their withdrawal was conducted with characteristic efficiency. However, the Legion's unity masked deep-seated resentments and power struggles that would emerge once they reached the relative safety of the Eye of Terror. Perdurabo's bitter rivalry with Rogel Dorn had intensified during the siege, and the Iron Warriors' failure to break the Imperial Palace's defenses had created a sense of frustration that permeated the entire Legion. The Primarchs' increasingly paranoid behavior created tensions within the command structure, as officers struggled to balance their loyalty to Perdurabo with their concerns about his mental state. The Iron Warriors' withdrawal was punctuated by brutal disciplinary actions against warriors who were perceived as insufficiently committed to the Legion's cause. The Word-Bearers' response to Horus's death reflected their unique position among the Traitor Legions. The 17th Legion had been the architects of the heresy, and their commitment to chaos worship provided them with a sense of purpose that transcended loyalty to any individual leader. Lorgar's influence over his sons remained strong, and the Legion's withdrawal was conducted with the same methodical approach they had applied to spreading corruption throughout the galaxy. The Word-Bearers' fleet became a mobile center of chaos worship, with ships' chapels converted into temples dedicated to the Dark Gods. The Legion's chaplains, now calling themselves Dark Apostles, worked to maintain morale and unity through religious fervor rather than military discipline. The 17th Legion's withdrawal was characterized by attempts to establish new centers of chaos worship along their route, as they sought to continue their mission of corrupting the Imperium even in defeat. The Thousand Suns situation was complicated by the extensive changes they had undergone following the burning of Prospero. The 15th Legion's survivors had been transformed by their association with Tzeentch, and many warriors had been reduced to empty suits of armor animated by psychic energy. Magnus, the Red Zone transformation into a demon prince, had created additional complications, as his presence was both a source of strength and a reminder of the Legion's fall from grace. The Thousand Suns' withdrawal was marked by strange psychic phenomena that affected both their own forces and nearby vessels. The Legion's sorcerers attempted to use their powers to facilitate the retreat, but their magic was unpredictable and often counterproductive. The 15th Legion's ships became focal points for warp storms and temporal anomalies that made navigation difficult and created additional hazards for the retreating traitor forces. The Alpha Legion's activities during the withdrawal remained characteristically mysterious. The 20th Legion had operated primarily through infiltration and misdirection throughout the heresy, and their response to Horus's death was equally subtle. Rather than engaging in open retreat, Alpha Legion operatives appeared to be implementing contingency plans that had been prepared well in advance. Their activities created confusion and uncertainty among both loyalist and traitor forces, as it became impossible to determine their true objectives or loyalties. The Night Lord's withdrawal was marked by the same terror tactics that had characterized their operations throughout the heresy. The 8th Legion had never been fully committed to Horus's cause, and their response to his death was pragmatic rather than emotional. Conrad Kerr's influence over his sons remained strong despite his increasingly erratic behavior, and the Legion's withdrawal was conducted with the same brutal efficiency they had displayed throughout the war. The strategic implications of the traitor withdrawal extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The collapse of the War Master's alliance system had eliminated the primary threat to the Imperium's survival, but it had also created new challenges for the loyalist forces. The fragmentation of the Traitor Legions meant that tracking and pursuing them would require different approaches for each faction, as their diverse motivations and capabilities demanded tailored responses. The Loyalist pursuit forces found themselves facing an enemy that no longer operated according to predictable patterns. The unified command structure that had enabled the Siege of Terra had been replaced by a collection of independent factions with different objectives and methods. Some traitor forces sought to reach the Eye of Terror as quickly as possible, while others appeared to be establishing new bases of operation in Imperial territory. The diversity of traitor responses created a complex strategic environment that challenged traditional military planning. The breakdown of communication between traitor factions created opportunities for loyalist forces to exploit divisions within their ranks. Intelligence reports indicated that some traitor forces were actively fighting each other, creating situations where loyalist intervention could potentially eliminate multiple threats simultaneously. However, the unpredictable nature of these conflicts made it difficult to plan effective interventions, as the tactical situation could change rapidly based on the whims of corrupted commanders. The pursuit of the retreating traitor forces was complicated by the need to maintain security in the Imperium's core territories. The Loyalist legions, already depleted by the siege, faced the challenge of simultaneously pursuing fleeing enemies and protecting vital installations from potential raids or infiltration attempts. The strategic balance between offensive and defensive operations would become a defining characteristic of the Great Scouring, as Loyalist commanders struggled to allocate their limited resources effectively. The Iron Warriors' withdrawal from the Sol system had been conducted with the methodical precision that characterized all of Perdurabo's military operations, but beneath the surface of their orderly retreat lay a seething cauldron of resentment and wounded pride. The Fourth Legion's failure to breach the Imperial Palace's defenses had struck at the very core of their identity as the Imperium's premier siege specialists. For decades, they had been the Emperor's chosen instrument for breaking the most formidable fortifications, reducing seemingly impregnable strongholds to rubble through a combination of superior engineering, relentless bombardment, and calculated brutality. Their inability to overcome Rogel Dorn's defensive preparations represented more than a tactical defeat. It was a fundamental challenge to their sense of purpose and superiority. Perdurabo's reaction to this failure manifested in increasingly erratic behavior that alarmed even his most loyal subordinates. The Primarch had always been prone to fits of rage and periods of brooding introspection, but his conduct during the withdrawal showed signs of deeper psychological fractures. He spent hours studying holographic displays of the Imperial Palace's defenses, obsessively analyzing every detail of the siege operations in search of the flaws that had led to their defeat. His quarters aboard the Iron Blood became a shrine to tactical failure, with walls covered in architectural diagrams, casualty reports, and intercepted Imperial communications that detailed the 7th Legion's defensive preparations. The Iron Warriors' fleet had maintained better cohesion than most other traitor forces during the chaotic retreat, but internal tensions were beginning to surface as the immediate crisis passed. Grand Battalion commanders who had led successful operations during the siege found themselves subjected to increasingly harsh criticism from their Primarch, who seemed determined to assign blame for the Legion's failure to anyone but himself. The traditional Iron Warrior's emphasis on cold logic and tactical analysis was being corrupted by Perdurabo's need to find scapegoats for their defeat, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that undermined the Legion's legendary discipline. The decision to establish a defensive position on Sebastus IV emerged from Perdurabo's obsessive analysis of the siege's failures, and his determination to prove that the Iron Warriors remained the galaxy's supreme masters of fortification warfare. The planet, located in the Sebastus system approximately 300 light-years from Terra, offered the ideal combination of strategic location and defensive potential that the Primarch required for his grand design. Sebastus IV was a harsh, mountainous world with limited natural resources, but extensive mineral deposits that could support large-scale construction projects. Its position along several major shipping routes made it a natural choke point that would force any pursuing Imperial forces to confront the Iron Warriors directly rather than bypassing their position. The planet's geography provided numerous advantages for defensive operations. The northern continent was dominated by a vast mountain range known as the Eternal Peaks, whose jagged summits and deep valleys offered natural defensive positions that could be enhanced through engineering. The southern regions consisted of rolling plains broken by rocky outcroppings and ancient riverbeds that could be transformed into killing fields through careful preparation. The planet's 3 moons provided additional opportunities for orbital defenses, while the asteroid belt in the outer system offered raw materials for construction and potential sites for early warning stations. Perdurabo's vision for Sebastus IV went far beyond the construction of a simple defensive position. The Primarch envisioned a fortress complex that would surpass even the Imperial Palace in its sophistication and defensive capabilities, a monument to Iron Warriors' engineering that would demonstrate their superiority over Rogaldorn's creations. The project would serve multiple purposes. It would provide a secure base of operations for the Legion's continued existence. It would attract Imperial attention and force a confrontation on favorable terms. And most importantly, it would prove that the Iron Warriors could construct defenses that were truly impregnable. The fortress complex that began to take shape on Sebastus IV represented the culmination of millennia of Iron Warriors' engineering expertise. The primary fortification, which Perdurabo designated as the Iron Cage, was designed as a series of concentric defensive rings that would channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones while providing maximum protection for the defenders. The outer perimeter consisted of a network of bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions that extended for hundreds of kilometers around the central fortress. These positions were connected by underground tunnels and supply routes that would allow defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The construction of the Iron Cage required the mobilization of the entire 4th Legion, with every warrior contributing to the massive engineering project according to their skills and specializations. Techmarine specialists supervised the installation of defensive systems and automated weapons platforms, while assault companies provided security for construction crews working in exposed positions. The Legion's mortal auxiliaries, including thousands of engineers and construction workers who had served with the Iron Warriors throughout the Heresy, were organized into specialized work gangs that operated around the clock to meet Perdurabo's demanding construction schedule. The fortress's design incorporated lessons learned from every major siege operation the Iron Warriors had conducted during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. The defensive positions were arranged to provide overlapping fields of fire that would prevent attackers from finding dead zones where they could advance without coming under fire. The fortifications were built to withstand orbital bombardment through the use of reinforced rockcrete and void shield generators, while underground facilities provided protection for command centers and supply depots. The complex included multiple redundant systems for power generation, communication, and life support that would allow the defenders to maintain operations, even if primary systems were damaged or destroyed. The Iron Cage's most innovative feature was its modular design, which allowed defensive positions to be reconfigured based on the direction and nature of enemy attacks. Automated systems could raise or lower barriers, redirect defensive fire, and even seal off compromised sections to prevent enemy penetration. The fortress incorporated elements of both Imperial and Xeno's defensive technologies that the Iron Warriors had encountered during their campaigns, creating a hybrid system that was unlike anything previously constructed by either loyalist or traitor forces. The construction process revealed the extent to which the Iron Warriors had been changed by their exposure to chaos corruption. Many warriors showed signs of physical mutation, with metallic growths and mechanical augmentations that went beyond standard Iron Warrior cybernetics. The Legion's Techmarines reported increasing difficulty in maintaining equipment that seemed to develop its own malevolent intelligence, while weapons and vehicles exhibited performance characteristics that defied conventional understanding. The fortress itself began to take on an organic quality that suggested it was becoming something more than a simple defensive installation. Reports of the Iron Warriors' activities on Sebastus IV reached Terra through a combination of intelligence sources and refugee accounts from nearby systems. The scale and sophistication of the construction project became apparent through long-range reconnaissance flights and intercepted communications between Iron Warriors units. The fortress complex was clearly designed to serve as more than a temporary refuge. It represented a permanent challenge to Imperial authority that could not be ignored indefinitely. Rogel Dorn's reaction to news of the Iron Cage's construction was immediate and visceral. The Imperial Fist's Primarch had been struggling with the psychological aftermath of the siege, tormented by his perceived failure to prevent the Emperor's near death and the massive casualties suffered by his legion. The knowledge that Perdurabo was constructing what appeared to be an impregnable fortress represented both a personal insult and a professional challenge that struck at the core of Dorn's identity as the Imperium's greatest defensive architect. The 7th Legion's losses during the siege had been catastrophic, with entire companies wiped out during the fighting in the palace's outer defenses. The survivors bore physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal, and many struggled with survivors' guilt and questions about their own worthiness. The Legion's traditional stoicism had been shaken by the scale of their losses and the knowledge that their sacrifice had not been sufficient to prevent the Emperor's fall. The prospect of confronting the Iron Warriors offered an opportunity for redemption that many Imperial Fists found irresistible. Dorn's obsession with the Iron Cage manifested in increasingly erratic behavior that alarmed his subordinates and fellow Primarchs. The normally methodical Primarch began issuing contradictory orders and changing strategic plans without explanation, while his personal quarters became filled with architectural models and tactical displays related to the Sebastus IV fortress. His interactions with other Legion commanders became strained as he rejected offers of assistance and insisted that the Imperial Fists alone were capable of reducing Perdurabo's stronghold. The Imperial Fist's preparation for the assault on Sebastus IV was conducted with the same attention to detail that had characterized their defense of the Imperial Palace, but the Legion's depleted state created significant challenges for mounting an effective offensive operation. The survivors of the siege were organized into new companies that bore little resemblance to their pre-war structure, with experienced sergeants commanding squads of recently promoted battle brothers and newly recruited initiates. The Legion's heavy weapons and siege equipment had been severely depleted during the fighting on Terra, requiring extensive resupply operations that strained the Imperium's already overtaxed logistics networks. The strategic situation surrounding Sebastus IV was complicated by the presence of other traitor forces in the region and the need to maintain security along the withdrawal routes from Terra. Intelligence reports indicated that elements of the Word-Bearers and Alpha Legion were operating in nearby systems, potentially in coordination with the Iron Warriors. The Imperial Fist's assault would need to account for the possibility of enemy reinforcements while maintaining sufficient reserves to deal with threats to their own supply lines. The approach to Sebastus IV required the Imperial Fists to traverse several systems that had been affected by the traitor withdrawal, with many worlds showing signs of recent fighting or abandonment. The Legion's advance elements encountered scattered resistance from traitor forces that had been left behind during the main withdrawal, creating a series of minor engagements that delayed the main assault force and provided the Iron Warriors with advance warning of the Imperial approach. The Imperial Fist's fleet that finally reached the Sebastus system represented the largest concentration of 7th Legion forces since the Siege of Terra, but it was a shadow of the mighty armada that had once patrolled the Sol system. The fleet included several battle barges that had been damaged during the siege and hastily repaired, along with strike cruisers and escort vessels that had been transferred from other Imperial forces to replace losses. The fleet's composition reflected the desperate nature of the Imperial Fist situation, with vessels pressed into service despite incomplete repairs and crews that included significant numbers of recently recruited personnel. The initial reconnaissance of Sebastus IV revealed the true scope of Perdurabo's construction project and the magnitude of the challenge facing the Imperial fists. The Iron Cage extended across an area larger than many cities, with defensive positions that had been carefully integrated into the planet's natural geography. The fortress complex included multiple layers of defenses that would require separate assault operations to overcome, while the presence of orbital defense platforms and fighter squadrons made it impossible to achieve surprise through rapid deployment. Dorn's decision to proceed with the assault, despite the tactical disadvantages, reflected his deteriorating mental state and his obsession with proving the Imperial Fist's superiority over their rivals. The Primarch rejected suggestions for a prolonged siege or attempts to bypass the fortress entirely, insisting that a direct assault would demonstrate the 7th Legion's courage and tactical superiority. His battle plan called for simultaneous attacks against multiple sections of the Iron Cage's perimeter, with the goal of overwhelming the defenders through sheer aggression and determination. The assault on the Iron Cage began with a massive orbital bombardment that was intended to suppress the fortress's defensive systems and create breaches in the outer perimeter. The Imperial Fist's fleet concentrated their fire on key defensive positions, but the fortress's void shields and reinforced construction proved remarkably resilient to the barrage. The bombardment succeeded in destroying some outer defensive positions, but failed to create the significant breaches that Dorn had anticipated, leaving the assault forces to advance against largely intact defenses. The first wave of Imperial Fist's drop pods descended into a carefully prepared killing field that demonstrated the full extent of Iron Warrior's defensive expertise. The landing zones had been pre-targeted by artillery batteries and automated defense systems that opened fire the moment the pods touched down. The assault troops found themselves advancing across terrain that had been transformed into a maze of obstacles, kill zones, and defensive positions that channeled their movement into predetermined paths where they could be engaged by concentrated fire. The fighting that erupted across the Iron Cage's perimeter was characterized by a level of brutality and sophistication that surpassed even the siege of Terra. The Iron Warriors had used their time on Sebastus IV to perfect their defensive techniques, creating a fortress that seemed to respond to Imperial attacks with almost organic intelligence. Defensive positions that appeared to be destroyed would suddenly reactivate as backup systems came online, while underground tunnels allowed Iron Warriors' forces to appear behind Imperial lines without warning. The Imperial Fist's assault quickly bogged down in a series of costly attacks against prepared positions that yielded minimal territorial gains. The Legion's traditional emphasis on frontal assault and unwavering determination proved inadequate against defenses that had been specifically designed to counter their tactical preferences. The casualty reports that reached Dorn's command post painted a grim picture of losses that the depleted Legion could not sustain, but the Primarch's obsession with victory prevented him from considering alternative approaches or strategic withdrawal. The siege of the Iron Cage continued for weeks as the Imperial Fists threw themselves against Perturabo's defenses with increasing desperation. The 7th Legion's losses mounted steadily as companies were ground down in futile attacks against positions that seemed to regenerate themselves after each assault. The fortress's defensive systems adapted to Imperial tactics with disturbing efficiency, suggesting that the Iron Warriors had created something that transcended conventional military engineering. The situation reached a critical point when reconnaissance reports indicated that the Imperial Fists had lost nearly half of their remaining strength, without achieving any significant penetration of the Iron Cage's defenses. The Legion's command structure was beginning to fracture as company commanders questioned the wisdom of continuing the assault, while medical facilities overflowed with wounded warriors who could not be adequately treated in the field. The prospect of complete annihilation loomed over the 7th Legion as they faced the reality that their greatest victory might also be their final battle. The arrival of Roboute Guilliman and a substantial Ultramarines force marked a turning point in the siege that would have profound implications for the future of the Great Scouring. The Ultramarines Primarch had been monitoring the situation at Sebastus IV with growing concern, recognizing that the Imperial Fist's destruction would represent a catastrophic loss for the loyalist cause. His decision to intervene reflected both strategic necessity and a growing understanding that the post-heresy Imperium would require new approaches to inter-legion cooperation and coordination. The pursuit of the Emperor's children across the galaxy presented loyalist forces with challenges that transcended conventional military operations. Unlike other traitor legions whose retreat patterns could be predicted through strategic analysis, the Third Legion's descent into Slaaneshi corruption had fundamentally altered their behavior in ways that defied rational understanding. Where the Iron Warriors maintained their disciplined withdrawal and the World Eaters left obvious trails of destruction, the Emperor's children moved through Imperial space like a plague of sensation seekers, their path marked by atrocities so bizarre and excessive that even experienced Imperial commanders struggled to comprehend their motivations. The transformation of the Third Legion had accelerated dramatically following their exposure to the Lair Blade and subsequent corruption by the Chaos god Slaanesh. What had begun as a pursuit of martial perfection had devolved into an obsession with experiencing every possible sensation, regardless of its source or consequences. The Legion's former discipline and tactical acumen had been replaced by an unpredictable hunger for new experiences that made their movements erratic and their objectives incomprehensible to conventional military thinking. Their ships had become floating laboratories of excess, where former Space Marines conducted experiments in sensation that would have been unthinkable during the Great Crusade. The first major engagement with fleeing Emperor's children forces occurred in the Proxima Centauri system, where elements of the Third Legion had established a temporary base on the industrial world of Proxima Tertius. The planet's massive manufacturing complexes and civilian population had provided the perfect environment for the Emperor's children to indulge their newfound appetites for sensation and corruption. Loyalist forces arriving in the system found a world transformed beyond recognition, with factory districts converted into vast amphitheaters where unspeakable performances took place before audiences of enslaved workers. The Imperial Fist's strike force that responded to distress calls from Proxima Tertius discovered that the Emperor's children had been using the planet's industrial infrastructure to create increasingly elaborate torture devices and sensory enhancement equipment. The factories that had once produced weapons and vehicles for the Imperial war effort had been converted into workshops where corrupted Techmarines crafted instruments of pain and pleasure, with the same attention to detail they had once applied to bolter maintenance. The civilian population had been subjected to experiments that tested the limits of human endurance and sensation, with survivors displaying physical and psychological trauma that defied medical understanding. The battle for Proxima Tertius revealed the extent to which the Emperor's children had been changed by their corruption. The Third Legion warriors who engaged the Imperial Fists bore little resemblance to the disciplined Space Marines they had once been. Their armor had been modified with additional sensory equipment and decorative elements that served no tactical purpose, but enhanced their ability to experience combat as a form of art. Many warriors had undergone surgical modifications that heightened their sensitivity to pain and pleasure, making them more dangerous in close combat, but also more unpredictable in their behavior. The Emperor's children's tactical approach during the engagement demonstrated their complete departure from conventional Space Marine doctrine. Rather than establishing defensive positions or attempting to achieve strategic objectives, they seemed more interested in creating spectacular displays of violence that would provide maximum sensory stimulation. Their attacks were characterized by excessive brutality and theatrical elements that served no military purpose, but satisfied their corrupted desires for new experiences. The Third Legion warriors fought with weapons that had been modified to cause maximum pain rather than efficient kills, prolonging engagements for their own perverse enjoyment. The Loyalist forces found themselves psychologically unprepared for the type of warfare the Emperor's children had embraced. The Imperial Fists, trained to expect disciplined opponents who followed recognizable tactical patterns, struggled to adapt to enemies who seemed to prioritize sensation over survival. The sight of former battle brothers who had mutilated themselves and their equipment in pursuit of new experiences created a profound sense of revulsion and confusion among the loyalist ranks. Many Imperial fists reported difficulty maintaining focus during combat as they witnessed atrocities that challenged their understanding of what Space Marines could become. The Emperor's Children's withdrawal from Proxima Tertius followed no recognizable pattern, with different companies and squads departing at different times and in different directions based on their individual desires rather than any coordinated plan. Some elements of the Third Legion remained on the planet to continue their experiments until they were finally eliminated by loyalist forces, while others departed suddenly when they became bored with their current activities. The lack of coordination made it impossible for loyalist commanders to predict their movements or intercept their retreat routes. The fragmentation of the Emperor's Children accelerated as they moved deeper into Imperial space, with the Legion splitting into smaller warbands that pursued their own interpretations of perfection and excess. These splinter groups, ranging in size from individual squads to entire companies, proved even more difficult to track and engage than the main Legion force. Each warband developed its own particular obsessions and methods, creating a diverse array of threats that required different tactical approaches to counter effectively. One of the most notorious splinter groups was led by Captain Lucius of the 13th Company, whose obsession with swordsmanship had been corrupted into a desire to experience defeat and death in combat. Lucius and his followers began seeking out the most skilled warriors in the galaxy, not to defeat them, but to experience the sensation of being bested in battle. Their raids targeted Imperial training facilities and warrior lodges, where they would challenge the most accomplished fighters to single combat before disappearing back into the void. The psychological impact of these encounters extended far beyond their immediate victims, as word spread of corrupted Space Marines who seemed to derive pleasure from their own defeat. Another significant warband was formed around the remnants of the Third Legion's cacophony, sonic weapon specialists who had become obsessed with the creation of perfect sounds. These warriors had modified their equipment to produce acoustic effects that could drive listeners to madness or ecstasy, transforming their weapons into instruments of psychological warfare. Their attacks on Imperial installations were characterized by the use of sonic weapons that caused structural damage while simultaneously affecting the mental state of defenders. The cacophony's raids often resulted in entire garrisons being found in states of catatonic bliss or homicidal rage, with survivors reporting auditory hallucinations that persisted long after the attack had ended. The pursuit of these fragmented warbands required loyalist forces to develop new tactics and strategies that differed significantly from conventional military operations. The Emperor's Children's unpredictable behavior made it impossible to establish effective blockades or predict their next targets, forcing loyalist commanders to adopt a reactive approach that emphasized rapid response and flexible deployment. The need to protect civilian populations from the Third Legion's depredations also complicated military planning, as traditional strategies that accepted collateral damage were inappropriate when dealing with enemies who actively sought to corrupt and torture non-combatants. The Ultramarines, with their emphasis on adaptability and comprehensive tactical doctrine, proved particularly effective in countering the Emperor's Children threat. Robute Guilliman's forces developed specialized protocols for dealing with corrupted Space Marines, including procedures for psychological preparation and post-combat debriefing that helped loyalist warriors cope with the trauma of fighting their former brothers. The Ultramarines also pioneered the use of mixed-unit tactics that combined Space Marine assault forces with Imperial Army support elements, creating flexible response teams that could adapt to the Emperor's Children's unpredictable methods. The White Scar's mobility and hit-and-run tactics made them natural opponents for the scattered Emperor's Children warbands, but the 5th Legion's warriors struggled with the psychological aspects of the conflict. The Khan's sons were accustomed to fighting honorable enemies who followed recognizable codes of conduct, and the Emperor's Children's descent into depravity created a profound sense of disgust and confusion among the White Scar's ranks. Many warriors reported difficulty maintaining their traditional emotional detachment during combat, as the sight of corrupted former brothers triggered responses that interfered with their tactical effectiveness. The Blood Angels faced unique challenges when confronting the Emperor's children, as their own genetic curse made them vulnerable to the same types of sensory overload that the Third Legion had embraced. The proximity of corrupted Space Marines, who had willingly embraced their darkest impulses, seemed to trigger episodes of the Black Rage among Blood Angels warriors, creating situations where loyalist forces became as unpredictable as their enemies. The Ninth Legion's commanders were forced to develop new deployment strategies that minimized their warriors' exposure to Emperor's Children corruption while still maintaining combat effectiveness. The tracking of Emperor's Children movements was complicated by their tendency to modify their ships and equipment in ways that made them difficult to identify through conventional means. The Third Legion's vessels had been extensively altered with decorative elements and sensory enhancement equipment that changed their sensor signatures and visual appearance. Many ships had been renamed multiple times as their crews pursued new aesthetic ideals, making it difficult for loyalist intelligence services to maintain accurate records of their locations and capabilities. The Emperor's Children's raids on Imperial installations followed no recognizable pattern beyond their desire for new experiences and sensations. Some attacks targeted military facilities where they could test their combat skills against disciplined opponents, while others focused on civilian centers where they could experiment with different forms of corruption and torture. The Third Legion's interest in artistic and cultural artifacts led to raids on museums and libraries, where they would steal items that appealed to their corrupted aesthetic sensibilities or destroy works that failed to meet their standards of perfection. The psychological impact of these raids extended far beyond their immediate victims, as reports of Emperor's Children atrocities spread throughout Imperial space and created a climate of fear and uncertainty. Civilian populations in threatened sectors began to exhibit signs of mass hysteria and paranoia, with many communities requesting evacuation or additional military protection. The knowledge that former Space Marines could descend to such depths of depravity challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of the Emperor's greatest warriors and created doubts about the reliability of other loyalist forces. The loyalist response to Emperor's Children activities was hampered by the difficulty of obtaining reliable intelligence about their movements and intentions. The Third Legion's corruption had made them resistant to conventional interrogation techniques, as captured warriors seemed to derive pleasure from torture and showed no inclination to provide useful information. The few prisoners who were taken alive often provided contradictory or obviously false information, making it impossible to determine whether their statements reflected genuine confusion or deliberate deception. The Emperor's Children's increasing mutation and physical transformation created additional challenges for loyalist forces attempting to identify and track them. Many Third Legion warriors had undergone surgical modifications or experienced spontaneous mutations that altered their appearance beyond recognition. The use of conventional identification methods became increasingly unreliable as corrupted Space Marines changed their physical characteristics to suit their aesthetic preferences or enhance their sensory capabilities. The fragmentation of the Emperor's Children continued to accelerate as they moved further from Imperial space, with individual warriors sometimes abandoning their units to pursue personal obsessions or join other warbands that better suited their particular interests. This constant flux made it impossible for loyalist intelligence services to maintain accurate assessments of Third Legion strength or organization, as units that had been tracked and identified could dissolve and reform in entirely different configurations without warning. The pursuit of Fulgrim himself proved to be the most challenging aspect of the hunt for the Emperor's Children. The Primarch's transformation into a demon prince had made him increasingly detached from his legion's activities, with his appearances among his sons becoming sporadic and unpredictable. Intelligence reports suggested that Fulgrim had become obsessed with pursuing perfect experiences that transcended physical reality, leading him to spend increasing amounts of time in the warp rather than directing his legion's operations in real space. The World Eater's withdrawal from the Sol system bore no resemblance to the organized retreats conducted by other traitor legions, where the Iron Warriors maintained their disciplined formations and the Emperor's children pursued their twisted pleasures with calculated excess. The 12th Legion's departure devolved into a galaxy-spanning bloodbath that consumed everything in its path. The death of Horus had severed the last tenuous thread of restraint that had kept Angron's sons from complete dissolution, transforming their retreat into a berserker rampage that claimed loyalist and traitor victims with equal fury. The Red Angel's condition had deteriorated dramatically during the final stages of the siege, with the Butcher's nails driving him into increasingly frequent episodes of uncontrollable rage. The neural implants that had been forced upon him during his gladiatorial slavery on Nuceria had been designed to enhance aggression and pain tolerance, but their interaction with his Primarch physiology had created a feedback loop of violence that was gradually destroying his sanity. The influence of Khorne, the blood god of chaos, had accelerated this process, feeding on Angron's rage and transforming it into something that transcended mere anger to become a fundamental force of destruction. The World Eater's fleet that departed Terra consisted of dozens of vessels in various states of disrepair, their hulls scarred by battle damage and their corridors stained with the blood of countless engagements. The ship's crews had been decimated by the same berserker fury that consumed the Legion's ground forces, with many vessels operating with skeleton crews of mortals who lived in constant terror of their Astartes masters. The fleet's organization had collapsed entirely, with individual ship captains making their own decisions about destinations and targets based on their desire for combat rather than any coherent strategic plan. The first major engagement involving the fleeing World Eaters occurred in the Genna system, where elements of the 12th Legion encountered a loyalist patrol consisting of Imperial Fists and White Scars vessels. The battle began when World Eaters' ships opened fire without warning or attempt at communication, their crews driven by an insatiable hunger for violence that overrode all other considerations. The engagement that followed demonstrated the extent to which the 12th Legion had abandoned conventional naval tactics in favor of brutal boarding actions and ramming attacks that maximized close combat opportunities. The World Eaters' boarding parties that assaulted the Loyalist vessels fought with a ferocity that shocked even experienced Imperial warriors. The 12th Legion's assault troops had modified their weapons and armor to enhance their capacity for melee combat, with many warriors wielding chain axes and chainswords that had been ritually blessed in the blood of their enemies. Their attacks were characterized by complete disregard for tactical objectives or self-preservation, with World Eaters warriors continuing to fight even after sustaining wounds that would have incapacitated normal Space Marines. The Loyalist defenders found themselves facing enemies who seemed to derive strength from their own injuries, with wounded World Eaters becoming even more aggressive and unpredictable as their pain receptors were overwhelmed by the Butcher's nails. The sight of former battle brothers who had mutilated themselves in pursuit of greater combat effectiveness created a profound psychological impact on the Imperial forces, who struggled to comprehend how Space Marines could willingly embrace such degradation. The boarding actions became prolonged slaughters that continued until one side was completely annihilated, with no quarter given or expected by either combatant. The fragmentation of the World Eaters accelerated as they moved deeper into Imperial space, with the Legion splitting into smaller warbands that operated independently of any central command structure. These splinter groups, ranging in size from individual squads to entire companies, were united only by their shared addiction to violence and their worship of Khorne. Each warband developed its own particular methods and preferences for combat, creating a diverse array of threats that shared the common characteristic of extreme aggression and unpredictability. Captain Karn, one of the few World Eaters officers who retained some measure of tactical awareness, attempted to rally scattered elements of the Legion around the principle of following Angron's example. However, the Primarch's increasingly erratic behavior made coherent leadership impossible, as his appearances among his sons served more to inflame their bloodlust than to provide strategic direction. Karn's efforts to maintain some semblance of Legion unity were complicated by his own gradual succumbing to the influence of the Butcher's nails, which made sustained concentration on complex planning increasingly difficult. The World Eater's path through Imperial space was marked by a series of increasingly brutal raids that targeted both military installations and civilian populations. The 12th Legion's hunger for combat led them to attack any target that promised resistance, regardless of its strategic value or the tactical situation. Their raids on Imperial army garrisons became exercises in pure slaughter, with World Eater's warriors competing to see who could claim the most skulls for their growing collections. The Legion's former emphasis on tactical efficiency had been replaced by a crude point system that measured success solely in terms of enemies killed and blood spilled. The difficulty of containing the World Eaters was compounded by their complete abandonment of conventional military logistics and supply systems. The 12th Legion's warbands had learned to sustain themselves through constant raiding and scavenging, taking what they needed from defeated enemies and abandoning damaged equipment rather than attempting repairs. This approach made them highly mobile and difficult to track, as they left no fixed bases or supply lines that could be targeted by loyalist forces. Their ships became mobile fortresses that could operate independently for extended periods, sustained by the spoils of their raids and the fanatical devotion of their crews. The loyalist response to World Eater's activities was hampered by the unpredictable nature of their attacks and the extreme violence they employed. Traditional military strategies that relied on predicting enemy movements and establishing defensive positions proved ineffective against opponents who seemed to choose their targets randomly and fought with complete disregard for their own survival. The 12th Legion's willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of minor tactical gains made it impossible to establish effective deterrence or defensive measures. The White Scars, with their emphasis on mobility and rapid response, proved particularly effective in countering isolated World Eaters' warbands, but even they struggled with the psychological aspects of fighting enemies who seemed to welcome death in combat. The Khan's warriors were accustomed to opponents who fought to achieve specific objectives, and the World Eaters' apparent desire for mutual annihilation created tactical situations that defied conventional understanding. Many White Scars reported difficulty maintaining their traditional emotional detachment during engagements, as the sight of former brothers who had embraced madness triggered responses that interfered with their combat effectiveness. The Blood Angels faced unique challenges when confronting World Eaters' forces, as their own genetic curse made them vulnerable to the same type of berserker rage that had consumed the 12th Legion. The proximity of corrupted space marines who had willingly embraced their violent impulses seemed to trigger episodes of the Black Rage among Blood Angels' warriors, creating situations where loyalist forces became as unpredictable as their enemies. The 9th Legion's commanders were forced to develop new deployment strategies that minimized their warriors' exposure to World Eaters' influence while still maintaining combat effectiveness. The Iron Hand's methodical approach to warfare proved surprisingly effective against World Eaters' tactics, as their emphasis on overwhelming firepower and mechanical precision allowed them to engage the 12th Legion at ranges where Berserker Fury provided no advantage. The 10th Legion's warriors had been psychologically prepared for the horrors of combat through their own experiences with cybernetic augmentation and the loss of their Primarch, making them less susceptible to the psychological warfare that the World Eaters employed. However, the Iron Hand's limited numbers meant that they could only engage small World Eaters' warbands, leaving larger groups to continue their rampage unchecked. The World Eaters' increasing mutation and physical transformation created additional challenges for loyalist forces attempting to identify and track them. Many 12th Legion warriors had undergone spontaneous mutations that enhanced their combat capabilities while making them increasingly inhuman in appearance. The butcher's nails had begun to merge with their nervous systems in ways that defied medical understanding, creating hybrid organic-mechanical entities that seemed to exist solely for the purpose of violence. The sight of these transformed warriors created profound psychological trauma among loyalist forces, who struggled to accept that their former brothers had become something that barely qualified as human. The fragmentation of the World Eaters continued to accelerate as they moved further from Imperial space, with individual warriors sometimes abandoning their units to pursue personal vendettas or join other warbands that offered greater opportunities for combat. This constant flux made it impossible for Loyalist intelligence services to maintain accurate assessments of 12th Legion strength or organization, as units that had been tracked and identified could dissolve and reform in entirely different configurations without warning. The World Eaters' abandonment of traditional military hierarchy meant that the death of a warband leader rarely resulted in the unit's dissolution, as other warriors would simply step forward to take command based on their combat prowess rather than formal rank. The pursuit of individual World Eaters' warbands required Loyalist forces to develop new tactics that emphasized speed and overwhelming force rather than the gradual attrition that characterized conventional warfare. The 12th Legion's Berserker tactics made prolonged engagements extremely costly for Loyalist forces, as World Eaters' warriors became more dangerous as battles continued and their rage intensified. The most effective approach proved to be rapid strikes that eliminated entire warbands before they could fully deploy their forces, but this required precise intelligence and coordination that was often difficult to achieve in the chaotic conditions of the Great Scouring. The World Eaters' raids on Imperial installations followed no recognizable pattern beyond their desire for combat and bloodshed. Some attacks targeted military facilities where they could test their skills against disciplined opponents, while others focused on civilian centers where they could indulge their appetite for slaughter without significant resistance. The 12th Legion's complete abandonment of strategic thinking meant that they would sometimes attack targets that offered no tactical advantage simply because they were available and promised violence. This unpredictability made it impossible for Imperial commanders to establish effective defensive priorities or allocate resources efficiently. The psychological impact of World Eaters' raids extended far beyond their immediate victims, as reports of their atrocities spread throughout Imperial space and created a climate of fear that affected military and civilian morale. The knowledge that former Space Marines could descend to such depths of savagery challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of the Emperor's greatest warriors and created doubts about the reliability of other Loyalist forces. Many Imperial Army units reported increased incidents of desertion and insubordination following encounters with World Eaters' forces, as mortal soldiers struggled to maintain their faith in the Imperium's ability to protect them from such threats. The World Eaters' increasing worship of Khorne manifested in ritualistic behavior that added new dimensions to their violence. The 12th Legion's warriors began to construct skull altars and blood shrines on their ships and in temporary bases, dedicating their kills to the blood god in elaborate ceremonies that combined elements of Nucerian gladiatorial traditions with newly developed chaos rituals. These practices served to further unite the scattered warbands around their shared devotion to violence, creating a religious framework that provided structure to their otherwise chaotic existence. The Loyalist forces' attempts to understand and counter World Eaters' tactics were complicated by the Legion's complete abandonment of conventional military doctrine. The 12th Legion's warriors no longer followed recognizable patterns of deployment or engagement, making it impossible to predict their behavior based on previous encounters. Each warband developed its own particular methods and preferences, creating a diverse array of threats that required different tactical approaches to counter effectively. The only consistent element was their commitment to close combat and their willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of their objectives. The tracking of World Eaters' movements was further complicated by their tendency to modify their ships and equipment in ways that made them difficult to identify through conventional means. The 12th Legion's vessels had been extensively altered with trophies and decorative elements taken from their victories, including the skulls of defeated enemies and banners made from the skin of their victims. Many ships had been renamed multiple times as their crews pursued new interpretations of Khornate worship, making it difficult for loyalist intelligence services to maintain accurate records of their locations and capabilities. The World Eaters' complete dissolution as a coherent military force accelerated as they encountered other chaos-worshipping groups and began to absorb or compete with them for territory and resources. Some warbands merged with cultist movements or renegade Imperial Army units, creating hybrid forces that combined Space Marine combat effectiveness with local knowledge and resources. Others engaged in brutal conflicts with rival chaos groups, viewing them as competitors for Khorne's favor rather than potential allies in their war against the Imperium. The Alpha Legion's response to the collapse of the War Master's rebellion defied every conventional understanding of military withdrawal and strategic retreat. While their fellow Traitor Legions either fled in chaotic disarray or established obvious strongholds, the 20th Legion seemed to simply vanish from Imperial censors, leaving behind only whispers, contradictory reports, and a growing sense of paranoia that infected every level of the loyalist command structure. The Alpha Legion had always been the most secretive and duplicitous of the Space Marine legions, but their activities during the Great Scouring elevated their shadow war to an art form that would haunt the Imperium for millennia to come. The unique nature of the Alpha Legion's organization made it impossible to assess their true losses during the Horus Heresy or track their movements during the aftermath. Unlike other legions that maintained clear command hierarchies and identifiable units, the 20th Legion operated through a complex network of cells, sleeper agents, and false identities that had been established throughout the galaxy during the Great Crusade. Their twin Primarchs, Alfarius and Omgan, had cultivated a culture of secrecy so pervasive that even their own warriors often operated without knowledge of their legion's true objectives or the identities of their fellow operatives. The Alpha Legion's infiltration capabilities had been demonstrated repeatedly during the Heresy, but the scope of their penetration into Imperial institutions only became apparent during the chaotic months following the Siege of Terra. As Loyalist forces struggled to reorganize and pursue the fleeing Traitor Legions, they discovered that their communications networks had been compromised, their supply lines disrupted, and their intelligence services penetrated by agents whose true loyalties remained unclear. The 20th Legion's operatives had spent decades establishing themselves within Imperial bureaucracies, military commands, and even other Space Marine legions, creating a vast network of assets that could be activated when needed. The first major indication of Alpha Legion activity during the Great Scouring came through a series of seemingly unrelated incidents that occurred across multiple sectors simultaneously. Imperial Navy vessels reported equipment failures and navigation errors that delayed their pursuit of traitor forces, while supply convoys experienced mysterious accidents that left Loyalist units critically short of ammunition and provisions. Communication blackouts affected key military installations at precisely the moments when coordination was most crucial, and intelligence reports contained contradictory information that led to costly tactical mistakes. The pattern of these incidents suggested a level of coordination and planning that exceeded anything the other Traitor Legions had demonstrated during their retreat. The Alpha Legion's operatives were not simply conducting random sabotage operations, but were implementing a comprehensive strategy designed to maximize confusion and minimize the effectiveness of Loyalist pursuit forces. Their actions demonstrated an intimate knowledge of Imperial procedures and vulnerabilities that could only have been acquired through years of careful observation and infiltration. The Loyalist response to these activities was hampered by the difficulty of distinguishing between legitimate equipment failures and deliberate sabotage, between honest mistakes and enemy action. The Alpha Legion's operatives had been trained to blend seamlessly into Imperial society, adopting the mannerisms, knowledge, and behavioral patterns of their assumed identities so completely that they became virtually indistinguishable from genuine Imperial personnel. Many had undergone surgical modification to alter their appearance and genetic markers, while others had assumed the identities of real Imperial citizens whose deaths had been carefully arranged and concealed. The paranoia that began to spread through Imperial ranks was perhaps the Alpha Legion's greatest weapon during this period. The knowledge that traitor operatives could be anywhere, wearing any face, and holding any position created an atmosphere of suspicion that undermined the trust and cooperation essential for effective military operations. Officers began to question the loyalty of their subordinates, while enlisted personnel reported their suspicions about colleagues whose behavior seemed even slightly unusual. The morale and cohesion of Imperial forces suffered as units became consumed by internal investigations and mutual suspicion. The White Scars encountered the Alpha Legion's shadow war firsthand during their pursuit of World Eater's forces through the Chogoris sector. The 5th Legion's rapid advance was repeatedly delayed by supply shortages and communication failures that seemed to occur at precisely the worst possible moments. When Khan Jagatai's forces finally cornered a World Eater's warband on the mining world of Kar Vastor, they discovered that their target had been warned of their approach and had prepared an ambush that cost the White Scars significant casualties. The intelligence that had enabled the World Eater's preparation could only have come from someone with access to the White Scars' operational plans, but investigations failed to identify the source of the leak. The Blood Angels faced similar challenges during their operations in the Baal sector, where their pursuit of Emperor's Children forces was consistently frustrated by what appeared to be coincidental obstacles and delays. Navigation charts contained subtle errors that led entire fleets off course, while supply requisitions were delayed or misdirected by administrative personnel who claimed to be following proper procedures. The 9th Legion's commanders began to suspect that their movements were being monitored and reported to enemy forces, but their attempts to identify the source of these leaks proved fruitless. The Alpha Legion's operatives demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Imperial psychology and organizational behavior that enabled them to manipulate loyalist forces without revealing their presence. They understood that direct confrontation would expose their limited numbers and compromise their network of assets, so they focused instead on creating confusion and inefficiency that would achieve strategic objectives without triggering massive security responses. Their actions were designed to appear as natural consequences of the chaos and disruption caused by the heresy, making it difficult for loyalist commanders to distinguish between enemy action and the inevitable friction of military operations. The 20th Legion's infiltration of other Space Marine legions represented perhaps their most audacious and dangerous operation. Alpha Legion operatives had spent years establishing themselves within loyalist forces, adopting the identities of fallen battle brothers and integrating themselves into squad structures and command hierarchies. These deep cover agents were virtually impossible to detect through conventional means, as they possessed genuine knowledge of their assumed identities, histories, and relationships, along with the combat skills and tactical knowledge expected of Space Marines. The discovery of Alpha Legion infiltrators within the Imperial Fists created a crisis of confidence that threatened to paralyze the 7th Legion's operations. The revelation came when a sergeant in the 4th Company was observed using combat techniques that were characteristic of Alpha Legion training, but unknown to Imperial Fists doctrine. Under interrogation, the suspect revealed that he had been operating as a sleeper agent for over a decade, having assumed the identity of a battle brother who had died during the Istvan V massacre. The implications of this discovery were staggering, as it suggested that other legions might be similarly compromised. The methods used by Alpha Legion operatives to maintain their cover identities demonstrated the 20th Legion's mastery of psychological manipulation and social engineering. They had studied the behavioral patterns and cultural norms of their target organizations so thoroughly that they could anticipate and respond to social situations with perfect authenticity. Their training included extensive instruction in the history, traditions, and internal politics of other legions, enabling them to participate in conversations and activities that would expose imposters who lacked such knowledge. The Alpha Legion's technological capabilities played a crucial role in their shadow war operations. The 20th Legion had developed sophisticated communication systems that allowed their operatives to coordinate activities across vast distances without detection by Imperial monitoring systems. These networks used encryption methods and transmission frequencies that were unknown to Imperial intelligence services, enabling Alpha Legion cells to share information and receive instructions while maintaining their cover identities. The technology also included devices that could interfere with Imperial communications and sensor systems, creating the equipment failures and navigation errors that plagued loyalist forces. The psychological warfare aspects of the Alpha Legion's operations extended beyond simple sabotage and intelligence gathering to include sophisticated disinformation campaigns designed to manipulate loyalist decision-making. False intelligence reports were carefully crafted to contain enough accurate information to appear credible, while including subtle distortions that would lead to tactical mistakes. These reports were often delivered through multiple channels to create the impression of independent confirmation, making it difficult for Imperial analysts to identify the deception. The Alpha Legion's understanding of Imperial bureaucracy enabled them to exploit the complex administrative systems that governed military operations. Their operatives had infiltrated key positions within the Adeptus Munitorum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and other organizations responsible for supplying and supporting loyalist forces. From these positions, they could delay or redirect supply shipments, alter maintenance schedules, and manipulate personnel assignments in ways that appeared to be routine administrative actions, but had significant operational consequences. The counterintelligence efforts initiated by loyalist forces in response to Alpha Legion activities marked the beginning of what would eventually become the Inquisition's primary mission. The realization that the Imperium faced enemies who could not be defeated through conventional military means led to the development of new investigative techniques and security procedures designed to identify and neutralize hidden threats. These early counterintelligence operations were crude compared to later inquisitorial methods, but they established the principles and practices that would define the Imperium's approach to internal security for millennia to come. The Ultramarines, with their emphasis on systematic analysis and comprehensive planning, proved particularly effective in developing counterintelligence protocols. Robute Guilliman's forces established specialized units tasked with investigating suspected security breaches and identifying potential enemy operatives. These units combined Space Marine combat capabilities with investigative skills that had been adapted from the Ultramarines' experience in governing the 500 worlds of Ultramar. Their methods included detailed background checks, psychological evaluations, and surveillance techniques that could identify behavioral anomalies that might indicate enemy infiltration. The Dark Angels' response to the Alpha Legion threat was complicated by their own secretive nature and the internal divisions created by the existence of the Fallen. The First Legion's traditional emphasis on secrecy and compartmentalized information made it difficult for them to implement the transparent security measures that were most effective against Alpha Legion infiltration. The Dark Angels' own hidden agendas and clandestine operations created an environment where unusual behavior and secretive activities were considered normal, providing perfect cover for enemy operatives who might have been detected more easily in other legions. The Iron Hand's methodical approach to security proved surprisingly effective against Alpha Legion infiltration attempts. The 10th Legion's emphasis on mechanical augmentation and cybernetic enhancement made it difficult for enemy operatives to maintain their cover identities, as the extensive modifications required to blend in with Iron Hand's culture were difficult to replicate convincingly. The Legion's cold, analytical approach to personal relationships also made it harder for infiltrators to establish the emotional connections that were essential for maintaining long-term cover identities. The Alpha Legion's operations during the Great Scouring demonstrated their ability to adapt their tactics to changing circumstances and exploit new opportunities as they arose. As loyalist forces developed counterintelligence measures and security protocols, the 20th Legion's operatives modified their methods to circumvent these defenses. They began using more sophisticated cover identities, employed new communication techniques, and developed alternative infiltration methods that took advantage of the chaos and confusion that characterized the post-heresy period. The long-term impact of Alpha Legion activities during the Great Scouring extended far beyond their immediate tactical effects. The paranoia and suspicion that their operations created would become permanent features of Imperial culture, influencing everything from military organization to civilian governance. The realization that enemies could hide behind any face and operate from within any institution led to the development of the surveillance systems and security measures that would define the Imperium's approach to internal threats for the rest of its existence. The Alpha Legion's Shadow War also demonstrated the limitations of conventional military thinking when confronted with unconventional threats. The Loyalist Legion's emphasis on honor, direct confrontation, and clear command structures made them vulnerable to enemies who operated through deception, manipulation, and indirect action. The lessons learned from these encounters would eventually lead to the development of new military doctrines and organizational structures designed to counter asymmetric threats, but the process of adaptation would take centuries and cost countless lives. The mystery surrounding the Alpha Legion's true objectives during the Great Scouring continues to generate debate among Imperial historians and intelligence analysts. Some evidence suggests that their operations were designed to protect the Imperium from threats that Loyalist forces could not recognize or counter effectively, while other indicators point to a more sinister agenda focused on the gradual corruption and subversion of Imperial institutions. The 20th Legion's mastery of deception and misdirection makes it impossible to determine their true motivations with certainty, ensuring that their Shadow War will remain one of the most enigmatic aspects of the post-heresy period. The Death Guard's transformation under Nurgle's malevolent influence had begun subtly during the latter stages of the Horus Heresy, manifesting first as minor ailments and unexplained infections that the Legion's apothecaries attributed to the stresses of prolonged warfare. However, by the time the 14th Legion began their withdrawal from the Sol system, the changes had accelerated into a grotesque metamorphosis that would fundamentally alter their nature as Space Marines. The once proud warriors who had endured the toxic atmosphere of Barbarous and prided themselves on their resilience against all forms of harm now found themselves becoming vectors of the very diseases they had once resisted. Mortarian's own transformation paralleled that of his sons, though the Primarch's superior physiology initially masked the extent of his corruption. The Death Lord's pale features had taken on a sickly pallor that went beyond his natural complexion, while his breathing apparatus, once a symbol of his mastery over toxic environments, now seemed to wheeze and rattle with each labored breath. His scythe's silence had begun to weep a viscous, greenish fluid that corroded whatever it touched, and his presence brought with it the stench of decay that no amount of ventilation could dispel from the Death Guard fleet's corridors. The Legion's withdrawal from Terra was conducted with the same methodical precision that had characterized their operations throughout the Great Crusade, but their ships had become floating plague laboratories where new forms of biological warfare were being developed through a combination of deliberate experimentation and spontaneous mutation. The Death Guard's traditional emphasis on endurance and attrition warfare had evolved into something far more sinister, as their apothecaries and tech marines worked to weaponize the diseases that were consuming their own bodies. The first Imperial worlds to experience the Death Guard's new methods of warfare were the agri-worlds of the Cadian sector, where the 14th Legion's advance elements established temporary bases while the main fleet regrouped following their departure from Terra. The planetary populations initially welcomed the arrival of Space Marines, believing them to be loyalist forces sent to protect them from traitor raids. This misconception was quickly corrected when the Death Guard began deploying viral weapons that had been cultivated from their own infected tissue and bodily fluids. the plague that swept through the Cadian agri-worlds defied every medical understanding that Imperial physicians possessed. The infection spread through multiple vectors simultaneously, transmitted through air, water, physical contact, and even through the consumption of contaminated food supplies. Victims experienced a rapid onset of symptoms that included suppurating lesions, respiratory failure, and neurological damage that left survivors in states of delirium and pain. The disease seemed to target the human immune system specifically, breaking down the body's natural defenses while keeping victims alive long enough to serve as breeding grounds for new strains of infection. The Death Guard's ground forces that deployed to these worlds bore little resemblance to the disciplined Space Marines they had once been. Their power armor had become fused with their flesh in places, creating grotesque hybrid forms where ceramite plates merged with rotting tissue and exposed bone. Many warriors had developed additional limbs or sensory organs that sprouted from their torsos and helmets, while others had lost entire sections of their bodies to decay without any apparent reduction in their combat effectiveness. The stench that accompanied their advance was so overwhelming that even other Chaos forces found it difficult to operate in close proximity to Death Guard units. The weapons employed by the transformed 14th Legion had been extensively modified to serve as delivery systems for biological agents. Bolter rounds had been replaced with specially designed ammunition that burst upon impact to release clouds of infectious spores, while flamers had been converted to spray corrosive chemicals that could eat through protective equipment and contaminate entire areas. The Legion's heavy weapons teams deployed virus bombs and chemical mortars that could render entire city blocks uninhabitable for decades, creating zones of permanent contamination that served as breeding grounds for new forms of plague. The loyalist response to these new weapons was initially hampered by a complete lack of understanding about their nature and effects. Imperial forces that encountered Death Guard units found their standard protective equipment inadequate against biological agents that could penetrate sealed armor systems and bypass conventional filtration methods. The diseases deployed by the 14th Legion seemed to adapt and evolve in real time, developing resistance to medical treatments and countermeasures almost as quickly as they could be implemented. The White Scars were among the first loyalist forces to engage the Death Guard during their plague campaigns, and the encounter demonstrated the extent to which the 14th Legion's transformation had altered their tactical capabilities. The 5th Legion's traditional hit and run tactics proved ineffective against enemies who could contaminate entire battlefields with their mere presence, while their emphasis on speed and mobility was negated by the need to maintain quarantine protocols and decontamination procedures. Many White Scars warriors reported that their bikes and vehicles became contaminated after brief exposure to Death Guard forces, requiring extensive purification rituals that often proved insufficient to prevent the spread of infection. The psychological impact of fighting the Death Guard extended beyond the immediate horror of their appearance and methods. The knowledge that former battle brothers had willingly embraced such corruption created a profound sense of revulsion and despair among loyalist forces, who struggled to comprehend how Space Marines could descend to such depths of degradation. The sight of Death Guard warriors who continued to fight despite having lost significant portions of their bodies to decay challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life and death, creating existential questions that many Imperial soldiers found impossible to answer. The Imperial Fist's encounter with Death Guard forces during the defense of the fortress world of Hydra Cordatus provided a stark demonstration of how the 14th Legion's new capabilities could neutralize traditional defensive advantages. The planet's massive fortifications, which had been designed to withstand conventional siege warfare, proved vulnerable to biological weapons that could seep through ventilation systems and contaminate water supplies. The garrison's defenders found themselves fighting not only against external assault forces, but also against diseases that spread through their own ranks, creating a two-front war that stretched their resources beyond the breaking point. The Death Guard siege of Hydra Cordatus lasted for months, during which time the 14th Legion demonstrated their mastery of biological warfare through the systematic contamination of the planet's entire ecosystem. Rivers and lakes became breeding grounds for waterborne pathogens, while the atmosphere itself was poisoned by airborne spores that made breathing dangerous even with protective equipment. The planet's agricultural systems collapsed as crops were infected with blights that rendered them toxic to human consumption, while livestock died in massive numbers from diseases that defied veterinary treatment. The development of Imperial countermeasures to Death Guard biological weapons required unprecedented cooperation between the Adeptus Mechanicus, the apothecaries of various Space Marine legions, and civilian medical authorities. The tech priests of Mars contributed their expertise in chemical analysis and equipment design, while Space Marine apothecaries provided knowledge of Astartes' physiology and combat medicine. Civilian physicians brought their understanding of disease transmission and public health measures, creating interdisciplinary teams that worked to develop new protective equipment and medical treatments. The first generation of anti-plague equipment developed during this period was crude but effective, consisting of sealed environmental suits that could maintain positive pressure to prevent contamination, along with sophisticated filtration systems that could remove biological agents from air and water supplies. The suits were bulky and cumbersome, reducing the mobility and combat effectiveness of troops who wore them, but they provided essential protection against the most dangerous Death Guard weapons. The development of these systems required massive industrial resources and represented a significant diversion of manufacturing capacity from other military priorities. The medical treatments developed to counter Death Guard plagues were equally revolutionary, incorporating both conventional medicine and more exotic approaches that drew upon the Imperium's limited understanding of chaos corruption. The most effective treatments combined broad-spectrum antibiotics with psychic healing techniques administered by trained psychers, along with surgical procedures that could remove infected tissue before contamination could spread. The development of these treatments required extensive human testing that raised ethical questions about the acceptable costs of military necessity. The Death Guard's response to Imperial countermeasures demonstrated their ability to adapt and evolve their biological weapons in real time. As Loyalist forces developed new protective equipment and medical treatments, the 14th Legion's plagues mutated to overcome these defenses, creating an arms race between Imperial science and chaos corruption. The diseases employed by the Death Guard seemed to possess an almost supernatural intelligence, adapting to new challenges with a speed that suggested they were being guided by forces beyond natural evolution. The siege of the hive world of Tallarn provided the most comprehensive test of Imperial anti-plague capabilities and revealed both the strengths and limitations of the countermeasures that had been developed. The planet's massive population centers and industrial infrastructure made it an ideal target for Death Guard biological weapons, while its strategic importance as a manufacturing hub meant that its loss would have significant implications for the broader war effort. The Imperial defenders included elements from multiple Space Marine legions, along with specialized units equipped with the latest anti-plague technology. The battle for Tallarn lasted for over a year and became a proving ground for new forms of warfare that would define the remainder of the Great Scouring. The Death Guard's assault began with the deployment of airborne pathogens that were designed to overwhelm the planet's atmospheric processors and contaminate the air supply for entire hive cities. The Imperial defenders responded with massive air filtration systems and sealed environmental zones that could maintain clean atmospheres for extended periods, but the scale of the contamination made it impossible to protect the entire population. The ground combat that followed demonstrated how Death Guard corruption could transform familiar battlefield environments into alien landscapes of decay and pestilence. Areas where the 14th Legion had established positions became zones of perpetual twilight, shrouded in toxic mists that corroded equipment and poisoned the soil. The very ground seemed to writhe with unnatural life, as fungi and bacterial colonies created carpets of corruption that could support Death Guard forces while proving lethal to unprotected Imperial troops. The Loyalist forces defending Tallarn were forced to develop new tactical doctrines that emphasized containment and quarantine rather than traditional offensive operations. Entire sectors of the planet were abandoned to Death Guard control when contamination levels became too high to permit safe operations, while Imperial forces established defensive perimeters around critical infrastructure and population centers. The fighting became a series of desperate holding actions designed to prevent the spread of corruption rather than achieve decisive military victories. The Death Guard's use of civilian populations as biological weapons represented a new level of horror that shocked even veteran Imperial commanders. The 14th Legion would deliberately infect captured civilians with experimental diseases before releasing them to return to Imperial-controlled areas, where they would serve as unwitting vectors for new forms of plague. These human weapons were often unaware of their condition until symptoms began to manifest, by which time they had already spread infection to their families and communities. The psychological warfare aspects of Death Guard operations extended beyond their use of biological weapons to include deliberate displays of corruption and decay that were designed to demoralize Imperial defenders. The 14th Legion would construct monuments from the corpses of their victims, arrange diseased bodies in patterns that suggested occult significance, and broadcast recordings of their victims' dying agonies across Imperial communication networks. These tactics were intended to create despair and hopelessness among Loyalist forces, undermining their will to resist even when they possessed superior numbers and equipment. The eventual confrontation between Mortarion and the Loyalist forces pursuing him occurred in the Plague Planet system, where the Death Guard had established a permanent base of operations that served as both a fortress and a laboratory for their biological experiments. The planet itself had been transformed into a living organism of sorts, with its atmosphere, water, and soil all contaminated by Nurgle's influence. The surface was covered with structures that seemed to grow rather than being built, creating a landscape that defied conventional military analysis. The Loyalist assault on the Plague Planet was led by a combined force that included elements from multiple Space Marine legions, along with specialized units equipped with the most advanced anti-plague technology available. The attacking forces were supported by orbital bombardment that was designed to sterilize large areas of the planet's surface, but the corruption had penetrated so deeply into the world's structure that conventional weapons proved insufficient to cleanse it completely. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the annals of Imperial military history, as Loyalist forces found themselves fighting not only against Death Guard defenders, but also against the planet itself. The ground would open without warning to release clouds of toxic gas, while the very air seemed to attack unprotected troops with airborne pathogens that could penetrate even the most sophisticated protective equipment. The planet's weather systems had been corrupted to produce acid rain and toxic fog that could disable vehicles and equipment, while the local fauna had been transformed into carriers for new forms of disease. The struggle against demonic corruption became a central challenge for Loyalist forces operating in areas where the Death Guard had established a prolonged presence. The diseases employed by the 14th Legion were not merely biological agents, but manifestations of chaos energy that could corrupt both flesh and spirit. Imperial troops who survived exposure to Death Guard plagues often reported psychological changes that included depression, despair, and a growing acceptance of corruption as an inevitable part of existence. The development of spiritual countermeasures to complement physical protection became a priority for Imperial forces, leading to the increased use of chaplains and other religious personnel in combat operations. These spiritual warriors provided not only tactical leadership, but also psychological support for troops who were struggling with the existential horror of fighting enemies who had embraced their own corruption. The rituals and ceremonies developed during this period would eventually become standard components of Imperial military doctrine, providing frameworks for maintaining morale and spiritual purity in the face of chaos corruption. The Death Guard's retreat toward the Eye of Terror was marked by a systematic campaign of biological warfare that left entire sectors of Imperial space uninhabitable for generations. The 14th Legion's path was marked by dead worlds, where nothing could grow, poisoned systems, where the very stars seemed dimmed by toxic clouds, and space lanes that remained dangerous to traverse due to lingering contamination. The long-term environmental damage caused by their passage would require centuries of remediation efforts and would serve as a permanent reminder of the horrors that chaos corruption could unleash upon the galaxy. The Word-Bearers' withdrawal from the Sol system differed markedly from the chaotic retreat of their fellow Traitor Legions, for the 17th Legion possessed something their brothers lacked: an unshakable sense of divine purpose that transcended loyalty to any mortal commander. While the Sons of Horus fragmented without their Primarchs' leadership, and the World Eaters descended into mindless bloodshed, the Word-Bearers maintained their cohesion through their absolute devotion to the Chaos Gods and their belief that the Horus Heresy had been merely the opening phase of a far grander conflict that would span millennia. Lorgar Aurelian's transformation during the final stages of the siege had accelerated beyond the physical mutations that marked other demon princes. The Urizen's ascension had been as much philosophical as corporeal, his mind expanding to encompass truths about the nature of reality that his mortal consciousness could never have contained. Where once he had been a seeker of truth who questioned the Emperor's secular vision, he had become a prophet of chaos who understood the fundamental role that suffering, change, excess, and decay played in the cosmic order. His presence aboard the flagship Fidelita's Lex radiated an aura of dark enlightenment that affected every word-bearer who came into contact with him. The 17th Legion's fleet maintained better discipline than most traitor forces during the withdrawal, but their ships had been transformed into mobile temples where the worship of chaos had reached new heights of sophistication and depravity. The vessel corridors that had once echoed with the chanting of imperial hymns now resonated with liturgies dedicated to the dark gods, while the chapels that had served as centers of imperial faith were converted into sanctuaries where demons could manifest in the material realm. The Word-Bearers' traditional emphasis on religious ceremony and ritual observance had been perverted into a comprehensive system of chaos worship that encompassed every aspect of their existence. The Legion's dark apostles, formerly chaplains who had guided their brothers in the worship of the Emperor, now served as conduits for the will of the Chaos Gods. These fallen priests had undergone their own transformations, their flesh marked with ritual scarification and demonic sigils that allowed them to channel the energies of the warp with unprecedented precision. Their sermons had become incantations that could summon lesser demons to the battlefield, while their presence alone could corrupt the faith of imperial defenders and turn loyal soldiers against their own commanders. The Word-Bearers' approach to fortification differed significantly from the purely military considerations that guided other legions. Their defensive positions were designed to serve dual purposes as both military strongholds and centers of chaos worship, with every bunker and trench incorporating elements that would facilitate demonic summoning and ritual sacrifice. The fortress monasteries they established on key worlds became focal points for warp energy that could corrupt entire planetary populations, transforming loyal imperial citizens into cultists who would serve the Legion's cause with fanatical devotion. The construction of these fortress monasteries required specialized knowledge that went beyond conventional military engineering. The Word-Bearers' Tech Marines worked in conjunction with Dark Apostles to create structures that existed simultaneously in the material realm and the warp, their foundations anchored in bedrock, while their spires reached into dimensions that mortal minds could not comprehend. The defensive systems incorporated demonic entities that had been bound into the fortress walls, creating living fortifications that could adapt to changing tactical situations and regenerate damage through the consumption of psychic energy. The fortress monastery established on the world of Sikaris represented the pinnacle of word-bearer engineering and religious architecture. The planet, which had served as the Legion's primary recruiting world during the Great Crusade, was transformed into a bastion of chaos worship that could support the 17th Legion's operations throughout the surrounding sectors. The massive complex that rose from the planet's surface combined elements of Imperial architecture with designs that had been revealed through demonic visions, creating a structure that seemed to shift and change depending on the observer's perspective. The Sikaris fortress incorporated multiple layers of defense that operated on both physical and spiritual levels. The outer walls were constructed from materials that had been blessed by the Chaos gods, making them resistant to conventional weapons while allowing them to channel warp energy into defensive systems. The interior chambers were arranged according to occult principles that enhanced the effectiveness of ritual ceremonies, while hidden passages connected different sections of the complex through routes that existed partially in the warp. The central cathedral could accommodate thousands of worshippers during major religious ceremonies, its vaulted ceiling decorated with frescoes that depicted the triumph of chaos over imperial order. The garrison that defended Sikaris included not only word-bearers space marines, but also vast numbers of cultists, mutants, and demonic entities that had been summoned through ritual sacrifice. The human cultists were drawn from the planet's original population, their minds broken through exposure to chaos corruption and rebuilt around absolute devotion to the dark gods. These fanatical followers served as expendable troops who could overwhelm enemy positions through sheer numbers, while their deaths in battle provided the psychic energy necessary to maintain the fortress's demonic defenses. The word-bearers' use of demonic summoning as a defensive strategy represented a significant evolution in their tactical doctrine. The Legion's sorcerers had developed techniques that allowed them to create stable portals between the material realm and the warp, enabling them to deploy demonic reinforcements at crucial moments during battle. These summoning rituals required careful preparation and the sacrifice of significant numbers of cultists, but they provided the word-bearers with access to forces that could not be defeated through conventional military means. The demons that served the word-bearers varied in their nature and capabilities, depending on which chaos god they served. Bloodletters of Khorne provided close combat support with their hellblades and supernatural strength, while plague-bearers of Nurgle could contaminate entire areas with their diseased touch. Demonettes of Slaanesh used their unnatural beauty and hypnotic abilities to confuse and corrupt enemy forces, while Horrors of Tzeentch wielded sorcerous powers that could reshape reality according to their whims. The coordination of these diverse forces required careful planning and extensive knowledge of demonic hierarchies and behaviors. The loyalist response to word-bearer fortress monasteries was complicated by the spiritual nature of their defenses. Conventional siege tactics proved inadequate against fortifications that could regenerate damage through warp energy, while the presence of demonic entities created psychological challenges that went beyond normal combat stress. Imperial forces found themselves fighting not only against physical enemies, but also against their own doubts and fears, as the word-bearers' corruption worked to undermine their faith in the Emperor and the righteousness of their cause. The Imperial Fist's assault on the word-bearer's stronghold at Genna Prime provided an early demonstration of the challenges posed by chaos-corrupted fortifications. The planet's fortress monastery had been constructed around a series of ancient ruins that predated human settlement, their alien architecture incorporated into the word-bearer defenses in ways that created disturbing spatial anomalies. Imperial forces found that rooms within the complex were larger on the inside than their external dimensions suggested, while corridors seemed to lead to destinations that changed depending on the time of day or the phase of the local moon. The siege of Genna Prime lasted for months as Imperial forces struggled to penetrate defenses that operated according to principles that defied conventional understanding. Artillery bombardments that should have destroyed entire sections of the fortress instead seemed to strengthen the word-bearer positions, as the psychic energy released by the explosions was channeled into demonic summoning rituals. The fortress walls absorbed the impact of macro-cannon shells and converted the kinetic energy into warp power that could be used to manifest new defensive positions or repair damaged sections. The Imperial assault troops who managed to breach the outer defenses found themselves fighting in environments that challenged their sanity as much as their combat skills. The fortress corridors were decorated with murals that seemed to move when viewed peripherally, while the air itself was thick with incense that induced hallucinations and religious ecstasy. The word-bearer defenders fought with weapons that had been blessed by the Chaos gods, their bolter rounds exploding with demonic fire, while their chainswords screamed with the voices of bound spirits. The psychological warfare employed by the word-bearers during these sieges was as sophisticated as their physical defenses. The Legion's Dark Apostles used their knowledge of Imperial religious doctrine to create corrupted versions of familiar hymns and prayers, broadcasting them across Imperial communication networks to sow confusion and doubt among loyalist forces. These twisted liturgies incorporated elements of chaos worship that could affect the minds of listeners, gradually eroding their faith in the Emperor while replacing it with devotion to the dark gods. The word-bearers' recruitment of new followers during their defensive campaigns demonstrated their understanding of human psychology and their ability to exploit the fears and desires that drove mortal behavior. The Legion's agents would infiltrate Imperial refugee camps and military installations, identifying individuals who were vulnerable to corruption due to trauma, loss, or disillusionment with Imperial authority. These potential recruits were gradually exposed to Chaos doctrine through seemingly innocent conversations and shared hardships, their conversion proceeding so slowly that they often remained unaware of their changing loyalties until it was too late to resist. The theological implications of the conflict between Imperial and Chaos forces became increasingly apparent as the Great Scouring progressed. The word-bearers' corruption represented more than simple military rebellion. It was a fundamental challenge to the Imperial truth that had formed the foundation of the Emperor's secular vision. The Legion's ability to summon demons and perform miraculous feats through chaos worship provided tangible evidence of the supernatural forces that the Emperor had sought to deny, creating philosophical questions that many Imperial soldiers found impossible to answer. The emerging Imperial Creed, which had begun to develop during the later stages of the Horus Heresy, provided a framework for understanding and combating chaos corruption that went beyond purely military considerations. The new religious doctrine acknowledged the existence of malevolent spiritual forces while maintaining that the Emperor possessed the divine authority necessary to protect humanity from their influence. This theological evolution represented a significant departure from the Imperial truth's atheistic materialism, but it provided Imperial forces with the spiritual tools necessary to resist chaos corruption. The role of Imperial chaplains became increasingly important as loyalist forces developed new methods for combating word-bearer corruption. These spiritual warriors served not only as sources of inspiration and morale, but also as guardians against the psychological effects of chaos exposure. The chaplain's training was expanded to include knowledge of chaos doctrine and corruption techniques, enabling them to identify and counter the subtle influences that word-bearer agents used to recruit new followers. Their presence on the battlefield provided a focal point for Imperial faith that could neutralize the corrupting effects of chaos rituals and demonic manifestations. The development of blessed weapons and sanctified equipment became a priority for Imperial forces operating against word-bearer strongholds. The Adeptus Mechanicus worked with Imperial chaplains to create weapons that had been consecrated through religious ceremony, their machine spirits strengthened through prayer and ritual purification. These blessed weapons proved more effective against demonic entities than conventional equipment, their shots disrupting the warp energy that sustained supernatural beings, while their impact created zones of spiritual purity that could weaken chaos corruption. The word-bearers' response to Imperial countermeasures demonstrated their adaptability and deep understanding of the forces they served. As loyalist forces developed new weapons and tactics to combat demonic entities, the 17th Legion modified their summoning rituals to call forth different types of demons that were less vulnerable to sanctified weapons. Their Dark Apostles began incorporating elements of Imperial religious doctrine into their own ceremonies, creating hybrid rituals that could confuse and corrupt imperial chaplains who attempted to counter them through conventional means. The siege of the fortress monastery on Colchis, the word-bearer's homeworld, represented the culmination of the loyalist campaign against the 17th Legion's strongholds. The planet held immense symbolic significance for both sides, as it was the birthplace of Lorgar and the site where the word-bearers had first embraced chaos worship. The fortress complex that had been constructed around the ruins of the ancient city of Heritage incorporated elements of the planet's pre-imperial religious traditions, creating a synthesis of human and alien spiritual practices that enhanced the effectiveness of chaos rituals. The assault on Colchis was led by a combined force that included elements from multiple Space Marine legions, along with specialized units equipped with the most advanced anti-chaos weapons and equipment available. The attacking forces were supported by a massive fleet that included several Gloriana-class battleships, their combined firepower capable of reducing entire continents to molten slag. However, the word-bearers' defenses had been prepared for such an assault, with the fortress monastery's spiritual shields capable of deflecting orbital bombardment while channeling the energy into demonic summoning rituals. The ground assault that followed was characterized by fighting that transcended the purely physical realm, as Imperial forces found themselves battling not only against word-bearer defenders, but also against the corrupted landscape itself. The planet's surface had been transformed through decades of chaos worship, its soil saturated with the blood of sacrificial victims, while its atmosphere was thick with psychic energy that could affect the minds of unprotected troops. The very ground seemed to resist Imperial advance, with trenches filling themselves and defensive positions regenerating through supernatural means. The word-bearers' final stand on Colchis demonstrated their complete transformation from Imperial Space Marines into servants of chaos. The Legion's warriors fought with weapons that channeled demonic power, their armor inscribed with blasphemous runes that provided protection against both physical and spiritual attacks. Their battle cries were incantations that could summon lesser demons to the battlefield, while their deaths in combat provided the psychic energy necessary to fuel increasingly powerful summoning rituals. The fortress monastery itself seemed to participate in the battle, its walls bleeding ichor, while its towers launched volleys of warp fire that could incinerate entire squads of Imperial troops. The loyalist victory on Colchis was achieved only through the sacrifice of thousands of Imperial soldiers and the complete destruction of the planet's biosphere. The final assault required the deployment of virus bombs and cyclonic torpedoes that sterilized the world's surface, while specialized Terminator squads fought their way through the fortress monastery's corridors to destroy the central summoning chamber. The word-bearers' defeat marked the end of their organized resistance in Imperial space, but their influence would continue to spread through the cults and corrupted populations they had left behind on dozens of worlds. The aftermath of the word-bearers' campaigns revealed the long-term challenges that chaos corruption posed to Imperial civilization. The worlds that had been exposed to the 17th Legion's influence showed signs of spiritual contamination that persisted long after the word-bearers themselves had been driven away. Civilian populations that had been exposed to chaos doctrine continued to practice forbidden rituals in secret, while the physical structures that had been used for demonic summoning remained as focal points for warp energy that could facilitate future manifestations. The Imperial response to this ongoing threat led to the development of new institutions and procedures that would define the Imperium's approach to spiritual security for millennia to come. The Ecclesiarchy, which had emerged from the early Imperial Creed, was granted expanded authority to investigate and combat chaos corruption, while specialized military units were trained to identify and eliminate cult activities. The Inquisition, though not yet formally established, began to take shape as various Imperial agencies recognized the need for coordinated counterintelligence operations against enemies who operated through spiritual corruption rather than conventional military means. The word-bearers' retreat toward the Eye of Terror was marked by a systematic campaign of corruption that left entire sectors of Imperial space vulnerable to future chaos incursions. The Legion's path was marked by hidden shrines and secret cults that would serve as beacons for future demonic manifestations, while the populations they had corrupted would continue to spread chaos doctrine through seemingly innocent religious practices. The long-term spiritual damage caused by their passage would require centuries of purification efforts and would serve as a constant reminder of the insidious nature of chaos corruption. The strategic situation facing the loyalist forces in the final phase of the Great Scouring had evolved into a complex web of interconnected campaigns that stretched across multiple sectors of the galaxy. The scattered nature of the traitor retreat had initially seemed to favor the Imperial cause, as the fragmented enemy forces appeared vulnerable to defeat in detail. However, as the pursuit progressed deeper into the galaxy's outer reaches, it became apparent that the Traitor Legions were not simply fleeing in panic, but were conducting a fighting withdrawal toward a predetermined destination that would provide them with sanctuary from Imperial retribution. The Eye of Terror, that massive warp storm that had scarred the galaxy since the fall of the Elder Empire, had become the focal point of traitor movements throughout the outer spiral arms. Intelligence reports from across the Segmentum Obscurus indicated that various traitor forces were converging on the region surrounding the Eye, establishing temporary bases and supply depots that suggested a coordinated effort to reach the storm's protective embrace. The implications of this development were staggering, as it meant that the Traitor Legions retained some form of unified command structure despite their apparent fragmentation. Robute Guilliman's analysis of the strategic situation revealed the true scope of the challenge facing the Loyalist forces. The Ultramarines Primarch had established his command center aboard the flagship Macraga's Honor, where teams of tactical analysts worked around the clock to process intelligence reports and coordinate the movements of Loyalist forces across dozens of star systems. The data they compiled painted a picture of enemy movements that defied conventional military logic, with traitor forces taking circuitous routes that avoided Imperial strongholds while maintaining their general trajectory toward the Eye of Terror. The coordination required to orchestrate such a complex withdrawal suggested that the Traitor Legions possessed communication networks and command structures that had survived the chaos following Horus's death. The Alpha Legion's infiltration capabilities provided one possible explanation for this coordination, as their operatives could relay information between scattered traitor forces without detection by Imperial intelligence services. However, the scale and sophistication of the withdrawal indicated that other factors were at work, possibly including demonic influence or the guidance of surviving Primarchs who had managed to maintain control over their forces. The Loyalist response to this revelation required a fundamental shift in strategic thinking. Rather than continuing to pursue individual traitor forces in isolation, Guilliman proposed a coordinated offensive that would establish a series of blocking positions along the major space lanes leading to the Eye of Terror. These positions would serve as anvils against which the fleeing traitor forces could be hammered by pursuing Loyalist units, preventing their escape while forcing them into decisive engagements on terms favorable to Imperial forces. The establishment of these blocking positions required the deployment of substantial naval forces to key star systems that controlled access to the Eye of Terror region. The Imperial Navy, still recovering from the losses sustained during the Horus Heresy, was stretched thin by the demands of supporting multiple simultaneous operations across such vast distances. Many of the fleet elements assigned to the blocking force consisted of vessels that had been hastily repaired after suffering damage during the Siege of Terra, their crews supplemented by personnel drawn from merchant marine and system defense forces. The fortress world of Cadia, strategically positioned near the Eye of Terror, became the primary staging area for the Loyalist offensive. The planet's massive defensive installations and extensive military infrastructure made it an ideal base of operations for the fleet elements and ground forces that would participate in the final push. The world's garrison, which had remained loyal throughout the heresy, was reinforced by elements from multiple Space Marine legions and Imperial Army regiments that had been transferred from other theaters of operation. The preparation of Cadia for its role as the primary Imperial stronghold in the region required extensive modifications to the planet's existing defenses. The fortress cities that dotted the world's surface were expanded and reinforced with new weapon systems designed to counter the types of threats that traitor forces might deploy. The planet's orbital defenses were strengthened with additional monitor stations and weapon platforms, while the system's asteroid belt was seeded with automated defense systems that could engage enemy vessels attempting to bypass the main defensive positions. The logistical challenges of supporting such a massive military buildup in a region so far from the Imperium's industrial centers required innovative solutions that would influence Imperial military doctrine for centuries to come. Supply convoys traveling to Cadia faced constant harassment from traitor raiders and Alpha Legion infiltrators, forcing the development of new escort procedures and communication protocols. The establishment of forward supply bases and maintenance facilities throughout the region created a network of installations that would serve as the foundation for the Imperium's long-term presence near the Eye of Terror. The first major engagement of the coordinated offensive occurred in the Belize Corona system, where a substantial force of Iron Warriors had established a temporary base while awaiting the arrival of other traitor elements. The Imperial Assault Force, consisting of Imperial Fists supported by Ultramarines and White Scars elements, found the enemy positions heavily fortified and defended by sophisticated weapon systems that had been rapidly deployed using prefabricated components. The battle that followed demonstrated the Iron Warriors' continued expertise in defensive warfare, as their positions proved remarkably resilient to orbital bombardment and ground assault. The Iron Warriors' defensive strategy at Belize Corona incorporated lessons learned from their previous engagements with loyalist forces, including the disastrous siege of the Iron Cage. Rather than constructing a single massive fortress that could be surrounded and reduced through attrition, they had established a network of smaller strongpoints that could provide mutual support while remaining mobile enough to be relocated if circumstances required. The defensive positions were connected by underground tunnels and communication networks that allowed the defenders to coordinate their response to Imperial attacks while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing tactical situations. The Loyalist assault on the Iron Warriors' positions required the development of new tactical approaches that combined the strengths of multiple legions while compensating for their individual weaknesses. The Imperial Fists provided expertise in siege warfare and the reduction of fortified positions, while the Ultramarines contributed their superior organization and logistical capabilities. The White Scars added mobility and rapid response capabilities that could exploit gaps in the enemy defenses, while specialized units equipped with the latest anti-chaos weapons provided the means to counter any demonic manifestations that might support the Iron Warriors. The fighting at Belize Corona continued for weeks as Imperial forces systematically reduced the Iron Warriors' defensive network through a combination of direct assault and siege tactics. The enemy positions proved remarkably resilient, with automated repair systems that could restore damaged sections while the defenders repositioned to new locations. The Iron Warriors' use of modular construction techniques allowed them to dismantle and relocate entire defensive positions overnight, forcing Imperial commanders to constantly adapt their assault plans to account for changing enemy dispositions. The breakthrough at Belize Corona came when White Scars reconnaissance units discovered a weakness in the Iron Warriors' tunnel network that could be exploited through a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The attack required precise timing and coordination between different Legion elements, with Imperial Fists assault troops providing the main thrust, while Ultramarines forces secured the flanks and White Scars units exploited the breakthrough to disrupt enemy communications. The success of this combined arms approach demonstrated the effectiveness of inter-legion cooperation and provided a model for future operations. The defeat of the Iron Warriors at Belize Corona sent shockwaves through the remaining traitor forces, as it demonstrated that even the most sophisticated defensive positions could be overcome through superior coordination and tactics. The survivors of the Fourth Legion were forced to abandon their carefully prepared positions and continue their retreat toward the Eye of Terror, leaving behind substantial quantities of equipment and supplies that would prove valuable to Imperial forces. The victory also provided loyalist commanders with intelligence about traitor movements and intentions that would prove crucial in planning subsequent operations. The Word-Bearers' response to the Imperial offensive demonstrated their continued commitment to spreading chaos corruption even as they retreated toward the Eye of Terror. Rather than simply fleeing from Imperial pursuit, the 17th Legion conducted a systematic campaign of corruption that left entire star systems vulnerable to future chaos incursions. Their path was marked by hidden shrines and secret cults that would serve as beacons for demonic manifestations, while the populations they had influenced continued to spread chaos doctrine through seemingly innocent religious practices. The loyalist forces pursuing the Word-Bearers found themselves fighting not only against the Legion's military forces, but also against the corrupted populations of worlds that had been exposed to their influence. Entire planetary governments had been infiltrated by chaos cultists who used their positions to sabotage Imperial operations and provide intelligence to the retreating traitor forces. The identification and elimination of these corruption networks required specialized counterintelligence operations that drew heavily on the expertise developed during the campaign against Alpha Legion infiltration. The Emperor's Children's fragmentation into smaller warbands created a different type of challenge for the pursuing loyalist forces. The scattered nature of the Third Legion's retreat made it impossible to predict their movements or establish effective blocking positions, as individual warbands followed their own desires rather than any coherent strategic plan. Some elements of the Legion continued to conduct raids against Imperial installations, seeking new experiences and sensations rather than attempting to reach the Eye of Terror. Others seem to have abandoned military objectives entirely, disappearing into the galactic wilderness to pursue their own twisted agendas. The World Eater's path toward the Eye of Terror was marked by a trail of destruction that claimed both Imperial and traitor victims. The 12th Legion's complete abandonment of strategic thinking made them unpredictable opponents who would attack any target that promised combat, regardless of its military significance. Their berserker fury made them extremely dangerous in close combat, but their lack of coordination and planning made them vulnerable to well-organized Imperial forces that could engage them at range or exploit their tendency toward reckless aggression. The Death Guard's retreat was characterized by the systematic contamination of entire star systems through the deployment of biological weapons that would render affected worlds uninhabitable for generations. The 14th Legion's path was marked by dead systems where nothing could survive, their planets reduced to lifeless husks by plagues that defied all attempts at medical treatment. The long-term environmental damage caused by their passage would require centuries of remediation efforts and would serve as a permanent reminder of the horrors that chaos corruption could unleash. The Alpha Legion's activities during the final phase of the Great Scouring remained as mysterious as ever, with their operatives continuing to conduct sabotage and infiltration operations that disrupted Imperial communications and supply lines. Their true objectives remained unclear, as some evidence suggested they were working to protect the Imperium from threats that loyalist forces could not recognize, while other indicators pointed to a more sinister agenda focused on the gradual corruption of Imperial institutions. The 20th Legion's mastery of deception and misdirection made it impossible to determine their true loyalties or intentions. The coordination of the final offensive required unprecedented cooperation between different Imperial institutions and military organizations. The Space Marine Legions provided the primary assault forces, while the Imperial Navy contributed the fleet elements necessary to establish and maintain the blocking positions. The Imperial Army supplied the garrison forces needed to hold captured territories, while the Adeptus Mechanicus provided the technical expertise required to maintain and repair the vast quantities of equipment involved in the operation. The establishment of permanent defensive positions around the Eye of Terror represented a fundamental shift in Imperial strategic thinking. Rather than simply pursuing the traitor forces to their destruction, the Imperium was preparing for a long-term containment strategy that would prevent future chaos incursions, while maintaining constant vigilance against threats that might emerge from the warp storm. The construction of these defensive installations required massive resources and would commit the Imperium to maintaining a substantial military presence in the region for the foreseeable future. The final engagements between loyalist and traitor forces occurred in the contested systems surrounding the Eye of Terror, where desperate battles raged as the remaining enemy forces made their last stands before entering the protective embrace of the warp storm. These battles were characterized by an intensity and brutality that surpassed even the Siege of Terra, as both sides fought with the knowledge that the outcome would determine the future of the galaxy. The traitor forces, faced with the prospect of eternal exile in the Eye of Terror, fought with desperate fury, while the loyalist forces were driven by the desire to finally end the rebellion that had cost the Imperium so dearly. The casualties sustained during these final engagements were staggering, with entire companies of Space Marines being wiped out in single battles as they struggled to prevent the traitor forces from reaching their sanctuary. The Imperial forces that survived these engagements were forever changed by their experiences, having witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The knowledge that their former brothers had willingly embraced such corruption created psychological scars that would influence Imperial military doctrine and culture for millennia to come. The establishment of the Cadian Gate as the primary Imperial stronghold guarding the Eye of Terror marked the beginning of a new phase in the Imperium's existence. The fortress world would serve as the first line of defense against future chaos incursions, its garrison maintained at constant readiness to respond to threats that might emerge from the warp storm. The planet's strategic importance would grow over the centuries, as it became the staging area for Imperial expeditions into the Eye of Terror and the primary base for monitoring chaos activity in the region. The cost of the Great Scouring's final phase was measured not only in lives lost, but also in the fundamental changes it wrought upon Imperial society and military organization. The revelation that Space Marines could fall to chaos corruption had shattered many of the assumptions that had guided Imperial military doctrine during the Great Crusade, forcing the development of new security procedures and organizational structures designed to prevent future betrayals. The establishment of the chaplain orders and the expansion of their role in maintaining spiritual purity became a permanent feature of Space Marine organization, while the development of counterintelligence capabilities would eventually lead to the creation of the Inquisition. The Pyrrhic nature of the Imperial victory was evident in the shattered state of the Loyalist legions and the massive reconstruction effort that would be required to restore the Imperium's military capabilities. The Space Marine legions that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands were reduced to mere shadows of their former strength, their ranks filled with hastily recruited and inadequately trained replacements. The Imperial Navy had lost thousands of vessels during the pursuit operations, while the Imperial Army had suffered casualties that would take decades to replace through normal recruitment procedures. The psychological impact of the Great Scouring extended far beyond the military forces that had participated in the campaign. The knowledge that the Emperor's greatest warriors could fall to corruption created a climate of suspicion and paranoia that would become a permanent feature of Imperial culture. The development of new religious doctrines and security procedures reflected the Imperium's recognition that its greatest threats might come from within rather than from external enemies, leading to the creation of the surveillance and control systems that would define Imperial society for the rest of its existence. The silence that settled over the Cadian Gate in the aftermath of the final traitor exodus carried with it the weight of a galaxy forever changed. The massive defensive installations that now ring the Eye of Terror stood as monuments to both Imperial determination and the terrible cost of victory. The fortress world of Cadia itself had been transformed into a bastion unlike any other in the Imperium, its surface scarred by the construction of defensive works that stretched from pole to pole. The planet's original population had been supplemented by millions of Imperial Guard regiments and naval personnel, while the system's asteroid belt bristled with automated weapon platforms and sensor arrays that maintained constant vigilance against the warp storm's malevolent influence. The loyalist Space Marine legions that had survived the Great Scouring bore little resemblance to the mighty forces that had once conquered the galaxy during the Great Crusade. The Imperial Fists, reduced to fewer than 400 battle brothers after their devastating losses at the Iron Cage and subsequent campaigns, struggled to maintain even basic company organization. The survivors were scattered across dozens of worlds, their traditional yellow armor now bearing the scars of countless battles against their former brothers. Many warriors had been forced to cannibalize equipment from fallen comrades, creating a patchwork of gear that reflected the desperate nature of their recent campaigns. The Blood Angels faced perhaps the most complex challenges in their post-Scouring existence. The death of Sanguinius had triggered genetic instabilities that manifested in increasingly frequent episodes of the Black Rage, while a new affliction called the Red Thirst had begun to appear among their ranks. The 9th Legion's remaining 800 battle brothers were organized into specialized units that could contain and channel these genetic curses, but the psychological burden of their condition weighed heavily on every warrior who bore the gene seed of the angel. Their fortress monastery on Baal had been converted into a combination medical facility and training ground where new techniques for managing their genetic legacy were constantly being developed. The White Scars had maintained better cohesion than many other legions, but their numbers had been reduced to approximately 600 battle brothers following their campaigns against the World Eaters and other traitor forces. The Khan's warriors had adapted their traditional mobile warfare doctrine to account for the new realities of post-heresy combat, developing specialized tactics for fighting corrupted space marines and demonic entities. Their fortress monastery on Chogoris had become a center for the development of new reconnaissance and rapid response techniques that would prove crucial in the decades to come. The Dark Angels presented the most enigmatic situation among the surviving legions. Their official strength was listed as nearly 1,000 battle brothers, but significant numbers of these warriors had been assigned to secretive units tasked with hunting the fallen angels who had sided with Luther during the destruction of Caliban. The First Legion's leadership had become increasingly paranoid and secretive, implementing security measures that made cooperation with other Imperial forces difficult. Their fortress monastery, constructed in the asteroid field that had once been their homeworld, served as both a base of operations and a prison for captured fallen angels. The Iron Hands had suffered disproportionate losses throughout the heresy and its aftermath, their strength reduced to fewer than 300 battle brothers organized into clan companies that bore little resemblance to their pre-war structure. The 10th Legion's survivors had embraced cybernetic augmentation to an even greater degree than before, with many warriors replacing entire limbs and organs with mechanical components. Their fortress monastery on Medusa had become a center for the development of new augmentation technologies that blurred the line between flesh and machine. The Salamanders and Raven Guard faced similar challenges in rebuilding their shattered forces. The 18th Legion's strength had been reduced to approximately 400 battle brothers, while the 19th Legion could muster fewer than 300 warriors. Both legions had been forced to modify their traditional recruitment and training procedures to account for their reduced numbers, implementing new techniques for rapidly producing replacement warriors while maintaining their unique combat doctrines and cultural traditions. The Ultramarines, despite their substantial losses during the Great Scouring, remained the largest and most organizationally intact of the surviving legions. Roboute Guilliman's forces numbered nearly 10,000 battle brothers, their ranks swollen by the absorption of loyalist elements from the shattered 2nd and 11th Legions, whose records had been expunged from Imperial history. The 13th Legion's fortress monastery on Mukrag had become the de facto headquarters for the coordination of post-heresy military operations, its vast libraries and training facilities serving as repositories for the tactical knowledge that would guide the Imperium's future development. The assessment of Legion capabilities in the aftermath of the Great Scouring revealed fundamental flaws in the organizational structure that had served the Imperium during the Great Crusade. The massive size of the original legions had made them vulnerable to wholesale corruption, as demonstrated by the ease with which entire formations had turned traitor during the heresy. The concentration of power in the hands of individual Primarchs had created single points of failure that could compromise entire sectors of the galaxy, while the lack of oversight and accountability had allowed corruption to spread unchecked through the ranks. Robute Guilliman's analysis of these problems led to the development of a comprehensive reform program that would fundamentally alter the nature of Space Marine organization. The Ultramarines Primarch had spent months studying the tactical reports and after-action analyses from the Great Scouring, identifying patterns of success and failure that could inform future military doctrine. His conclusions were compiled into a massive document that would become known as the Codex Astartes, a comprehensive guide to Space Marine organization, tactics, and conduct that would serve as the foundation for Imperial military doctrine for millennia to come. The central principle of the Codex Astartes was the division of the existing Space Marine legions into smaller, more manageable units called chapters. Each chapter would consist of approximately 1,000 battle brothers organized into 10 companies, with each company specialized for specific tactical roles and combat situations. This structure would prevent any single commander from wielding the massive power that had enabled the traitor Primarchs to challenge the Emperor's authority, while maintaining the flexibility and combat effectiveness that had made the Space Marines the Imperium's most valuable military asset. The implementation of the Second Founding required careful consideration of each legion's unique characteristics and capabilities. The Ultramarines, as the largest surviving legion, would be divided into multiple chapters that could maintain the 13th Legion's tactical doctrines while operating independently. The Imperial Fists would form the core of several new chapters, including the Black Templars and Crimson Fists, each inheriting specific aspects of the 7th Legion's defensive expertise and siege warfare capabilities. The Blood Angels' genetic instabilities required special consideration during the Second Founding process. The 9th Legion's successors would need to be carefully monitored for signs of the Black Rage and Red Thirst, with specialized training programs and support structures designed to help them manage these conditions. The Flesh Terrors and Blood Drinkers were among the first successor chapters created from Blood Angels' gene seed, their warriors selected for their ability to control their genetic curses while maintaining combat effectiveness. The White Scar's mobile warfare doctrine was preserved through the creation of successor chapters that specialized in rapid deployment and hit-and-run tactics. The Storm Lords and Marauders inherited the 5th Legion's expertise in reconnaissance and fast attack operations, while maintaining the cultural traditions and recruitment practices that had made the White Scars effective throughout the Great Crusade and Heresy. The Dark Angels' secretive nature complicated their participation in the Second Founding, as the 1st Legion's leadership was reluctant to share information about their organization and capabilities. The Angels of Absolution and Angels of Redemption were created from Dark Angels' gene seed, but their exact relationship to the parent legion remained unclear. The new chapters were integrated into the same secretive network that governed Dark Angels' operations, ensuring that the hunt for the fallen angels would continue across multiple organizations. The Iron Hand's emphasis on cybernetic augmentation was passed on to their successor chapters, including the Iron Skulls and Steel Confessors. These new formations inherited the 10th Legion's expertise in mechanized warfare and technological adaptation, while developing their own interpretations of the relationship between flesh and machine. The creation of these chapters required close cooperation with the Adeptus Mechanicus, as the complex augmentation procedures required specialized knowledge and equipment. The Salamanders and Raven Guard, despite their reduced numbers, were able to contribute to the Second Founding through the creation of successor chapters that specialized in their unique combat doctrines. The Storm Giants inherited the Salamander's expertise in siege warfare and equipment maintenance, while the Raptors carried on the Raven Guard's traditions of stealth and infiltration. These new chapters were carefully monitored to ensure that they could maintain their specialized capabilities despite their separation from their parent legions. The process of creating new chapters required extensive modifications to existing recruitment and training procedures. The apothecaries responsible for gene seed implantation had to develop new techniques for screening potential recruits and monitoring the development of genetic modifications. The reduced size of the new chapters meant that each battle brother represented a more significant investment in time and resources, requiring more intensive training and support than had been possible during the mass recruitment drives of the Great Crusade. The establishment of new chapter homeworlds became a priority as the Second Founding progressed. Many of the worlds that had served as Legion recruiting grounds were divided among multiple successor chapters, while new worlds were identified and developed to support the expanded number of Space Marine formations. The selection of these homeworlds required careful consideration of their defensive capabilities, recruitment potential, and strategic location within the broader Imperial military structure. The creation of the Inquisition represented another fundamental change in Imperial organization that emerged from the lessons learned during the Great Scouring. The revelation that corruption could spread through the highest levels of Imperial society had demonstrated the need for an independent organization capable of investigating and combating threats that conventional military forces could not address. The early Inquisitors were drawn from the ranks of Imperial agents who had distinguished themselves during the counterintelligence operations against the Alpha Legion and Word-Bearers. The Inquisition's initial organization reflected the diverse nature of the threats it was designed to combat. The Ordo Malleus was established to investigate and combat demonic incursions, drawing on the expertise developed during the campaigns against the Word-Bearers and their corrupted allies. The Ordo Hereticus focused on identifying and eliminating heretical movements within Imperial society, while the Ordo Xenos was tasked with monitoring and combating alien threats that might exploit the Imperium's weakened state. The development of inquisitorial procedures and methods required extensive experimentation and refinement. The early Inquisitors had to develop new techniques for identifying corruption and heresy that went beyond conventional interrogation and investigation methods. The use of psychers in investigative roles became standard practice, while the development of specialized equipment and weapons provided Inquisitors with the tools necessary to combat supernatural threats. The establishment of the Adeptus Archives as the Imperium's primary law enforcement organization represented another significant institutional change that emerged from the post-heresy reorganization. The need for a unified system of justice and law enforcement had become apparent during the chaos that followed the Siege of Terra, when local authorities had proven inadequate to maintain order in the face of widespread corruption and rebellion. The Archives were given authority to enforce imperial law across all levels of society, from the lowest hive dweller to the highest planetary governor. The creation of the Officio Assassinorum as a formal imperial institution reflected the recognition that conventional military forces were insufficient to deal with certain types of threats. The various assassin temples that had operated in secrecy during the Great Crusade were brought under direct imperial control and given expanded mandates to eliminate targets that posed threats to imperial security. The Vindicare Temple specialized in long-range elimination of specific individuals, while the Calidus Temple focused on infiltration and close-quarters assassination. The reorganization of the Imperial Guard represented a fundamental shift in the Imperium's approach to conventional military forces. The massive armies that had served during the Great Crusade were broken down into smaller, more manageable regiments that could be deployed independently or combined for larger operations. This structure reduced the risk of wholesale corruption while maintaining the flexibility necessary for effective military operations across the galaxy's diverse environments. The development of new military doctrines and training procedures reflected the lessons learned from fighting corrupted space marines and demonic entities. Imperial Guard regiments were trained to recognize and respond to signs of chaos corruption, while specialized units were created to provide support for Space Marine operations against supernatural threats. The integration of commissars into Guard command structures provided political oversight and morale support that helped prevent the spread of heretical ideas among the ranks. The establishment of the Imperial Navy as an independent service branch reflected the recognition that space-based operations required specialized knowledge and equipment that differed significantly from ground-based military operations. The Navy's responsibilities included not only fleet combat operations, but also the maintenance of communication networks and supply lines that connected the Imperium's far-flung territories. The development of new ship designs and weapon systems incorporated lessons learned from the naval battles of the Great Scouring. The creation of the Adeptus Mechanicus as a semi-autonomous organization within the imperial structure represented a compromise between the need for technological expertise and the desire for centralized control. The tech priests of Mars had proven their loyalty during the heresy, but their unique culture and beliefs required special consideration within the broader imperial framework. The Mechanicus was granted authority over technological development and manufacturing, while remaining subject to imperial oversight and regulation. The long-term consequences of the Great Scouring extended far beyond the immediate military and political changes that emerged from the conflict. The psychological impact of the heresy had fundamentally altered imperial culture, creating a climate of suspicion and paranoia that would define the Imperium's approach to governance for millennia to come. The knowledge that the Emperor's greatest warriors could fall to corruption had shattered many of the assumptions that had guided imperial society during the Great Crusade, forcing the development of new institutions and procedures designed to prevent future betrayals. The establishment of the Imperial Creed as the official religion of the Imperium represented a complete reversal of the Emperor's original vision of a secular, rational society. The need for spiritual weapons against chaos corruption had made religious faith a practical necessity rather than a philosophical choice, while the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne had provided a focus for worship that could unite the Imperium's diverse populations. The development of the ecclesiarchy as the institution responsible for maintaining religious orthodoxy reflected the recognition that spiritual unity was essential for imperial survival. The economic impact of the Great Scouring required massive reconstruction efforts that would consume imperial resources for centuries to come. Entire sectors had been devastated by the fighting, their industrial infrastructure destroyed, and their populations scattered or corrupted. The development of new manufacturing centers and supply networks required unprecedented coordination between different imperial institutions, while the need to maintain constant vigilance against chaos incursions imposed ongoing costs that strained the Imperium's resources. The Great Scouring had ended with the Traitor Legions driven into the Eye of Terror, but the victory had come at a cost that would echo through the millennia. The Imperium that emerged from the ashes of the heresy was a darker, more paranoid version of the Emperor's original vision, shaped by the knowledge that corruption could emerge from within as easily as from without. The institutions created during this period would define imperial civilization for the next 10,000 years, their rigid structures and suspicious nature serving as both protection against future threats and barriers to the progress and enlightenment that the Emperor had originally sought to achieve. The legacy of the Great Scouring was written not only in the new institutions and military organizations that emerged from the conflict, but also in the fundamental changes to imperial culture and society that would persist long after the last traitor had fled into the warp. The Imperium had survived its greatest test, but the price of survival had been the transformation of humanity's greatest achievement into a fortress state where freedom and progress were sacrificed on the altar of security and survival. The galaxy would never again know the optimism and unity of the Great Crusade, for the Great Scouring had taught humanity that even its greatest heroes could fall to darkness, and that eternal vigilance was the price of continued existence in a universe where the very gods themselves sought humanity's destruction.